Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Manhattan Institute's conference on Mayor Eric Adams' first 100 days in office, and to the launch of our Klinsky Leadership Series, which, thanks to the generosity of Steve Klinsky, brings the best policy ideas to bear for the future of our city. When Eric Adams got to work on January 1st, his first day in office, he looked ahead to his next 99 days and said he would, and I quote, "get stuff done." That 100-day mark is now fast approaching, next week, in fact. So what has Mayor Adams done? And what should he get done on his next 1,361 days in office, if not longer? Most importantly, what is the future of New York City? Can we make this a bigger apple and a better city for generations to come? The city's list of stuff to get done is long. Take New York's rising crime. Our latest Manhattan Institute poll finds 92% of New Yorkers worried about crime. 92%. This isn't a partisan issue. It's a very human issue when our fellow New Yorkers not only feel unsafe, but all too often are unsafe on the subways, on the streets, and in their homes. Of course, violence and disorder do not occur in a vacuum. They are a matter of policing and criminal justice. They raise vital questions around how we address severe mental illness, hate crimes, substance abuse, and even trash on the streets. Or how about the Big Apple's giant jobs deficit? New York City is lagging the entire country on that account, with an unemployment rate of 7.6%. Thousands of would-be workers are still searching for jobs, especially in the hard-hit leisure and hospitality sector, which has for so long been the backbone of the city's working class. All the while, New York's economy is continuing to evolve, changing the landscape for labor. How can we bring jobs back and train the workforce of tomorrow? We have a great program ahead to ask and answer these questions and more. We are thrilled to be joined by New York One's Errol Lewis and the city's Alyssa Katz. We have Gridlock Sam himself, as well as former DA Jimmy Quinn, before closing our program with a New York legend, Joel Klein, and our very own senior fellow and Wall Street Journal columnist, Jason Riley. But now it is my great honor to welcome Congressman Ritchie Torres to our program. Congressman Torres is hard at work in Washington as we speak, and he's kindly agreed to join us remotely to kick off our discussion with a big picture look at the city he serves and loves. Congressman Torres represents the 15th Congressional District in the South Bronx and sits on the Committee on Financial Services and is the vice chair of the Committee on Homeland Security. He was previously elected to the City Council at the age of 25 as New York's youngest elected official and the first openly LGBTQ person elected to office in the Bronx. Congressman, thank you very much for joining us. I want to start with a simple question. What, in your view, is the state of New York City today?
New York City, well, first, it's an honor to be here. New York City has a long road to recovery. We were the first to be hit the hardest by COVID-19, and I fear that we might be the last to recover. Ridership in the subway system, the attendance rate in public schools, the crime rate, the employment rate in New York City, all of these metrics of urban health are far below their pre-pandemic levels. And as you indicated in your speech, the issue that weighs most heavily on New Yorkers is crime, is public safety. And from 2018 to 2021, we saw a 60% rise in the murder rate. In the past 2 years, we've seen more than 70% rise in the number of shooting incidents and shooting victims. The people feel unsafe in the city. I mean, I'll just share personal. I used to take the subway every single day for most of my life. And I've lost the sense of safety that I once felt in our subway system. And in the past 100 days, the city's no safer today than it was at the beginning of 2022. The recovery of New York City, depends heavily on people returning to the workplace. I think Mayor Adams has been calling on the largest employers to send workers back to the office because we need people to ride in the subways and patronize local businesses and work from the office. But that ecosystem has been radically upended by COVID-19, and whether it will be restored and how quickly remains an open question, and that's going to be a structural challenge to the recovery of New York City. Half of our revenues come from real estate, much of it from commercial real estate, which has been disrupted by COVID.
Thanks very much, Congressman Torres. In February, you declared defund the police dead in New York City. What did you mean by that?
Well, the pendulum has swung against defund police. And the majority of Americans, the majority of New Yorkers are in favor of reforming rather than defunding the police. I genuinely believe that what most people want is not less policing or more policing, but better policing, more effective policing. I remember a few years ago, I had a conversation with someone in politics who was an advocate for defund police. And, I said to him, let me get this straight. You want to conduct a social experiment, defund police, on my district in the South Bronx. And my question to you is, what happens if that experiment goes badly? What happens if it leads to an outbreak of gang violence and gun violence and youth violence? This person to whom I was speaking, he lives in a wealthier, safer neighborhood. He's ensconced in his ivory tower, whereas poor people of color in places like the South Bronx would have to live with the consequences of someone else's luxury belief. And there's something radically wrong with that picture. And there's an effort by organizations like the Democratic Socialists of America to defund the NYPD by 50% in the midst of a violent crime surge. And that strikes me as profoundly tone-deaf and irresponsible.
How should we get stuff done, as Mayor Adams puts it, on public safety? What do you make of his agenda for fighting crime?
It seems to me the mayor's attempting to take a comprehensive approach. Investing in summer youth employment, investing in violence interrupters, establishing an anti-gun unit. We've seen an explosion of guns on the streets of New York. One element that's often overlooked is the mental health dimension. I support both the governor and the mayor's call to not only reauthorize, but also expand Kendra's law. I think so much of what drives not only chronic incarceration, but chronic substance abuse and chronic addiction and chronic homelessness is severe mental illness. And in my opinion, both the federal government with the IMD exclusion and the state government with the closing of all these psychiatric beds have swung the pendulum too far in the direction of deinstitutionalization. We have to recognize that there are a subset of people whose mental illness is so severe that those people require inpatient psychiatric care. There's nothing progressive about allowing the seriously mentally ill to languish on the streets, untreated, posing a threat to themselves and to everyone around them. So that to me is one of the intractable causes of some of the crime we've seen. Certainly in the case of Michelle Go, who was shoved in front of a subway car by someone who's mentally disturbed.
Do you see the right solution as being primarily about an infusion of resources, increasing spending on mental health services, on proactive policing, or do you see it as addressing, for example, the recent bail law and various other provisions that many in law enforcement believe are inhibiting their ability to effectively deal with the rise in public disorder?
I suspect the crime surge has multiple causes. It is certainly the case that Mayor Adams' vision of public safety is quite different from the state legislatures, especially on the subject of bail reform. There could be a compromise in which judges have greater discretion to consider public safety, and maybe you can subject the law to an annual reauthorization, which would allow the state legislature to examine the manner in which judges are exercising their discretion. But it's unthinkable to me that the state legislature is going to revise bail reform. It seems like the state legislature is intransigent on that issue.
The Manhattan Institute recently released a report on the rise in hate crimes, particularly anti-Semitic and anti-Asian hate crimes in New York City. I wonder, can you tell us a bit about your thoughts about the surge in hate crimes, and what do you think would be appropriate steps to tackle it?
Well, there certainly has been a surge in hate crimes, specifically against the Asian community and the Jewish community. A few years ago, the Anti-Defamation League reported that the number of anti-Semitic incidents had risen to levels not seen in 4 decades. The FBI has reported that the majority of religiously motivated hate crimes is specifically targeted toward the Jewish community. And it was recently reported by the Daily News that the number of anti-Semitic incidents here in New York City have quadrupled in the past year. We saw in May of 2021, during the conflict between Israel and Hamas, just how the hysterical demonization of Israel led to an outbreak of anti-Semitic violence and vitriol. There was an explosive device thrown in the heart of the Diamond District. There was a gentleman with a yarmulke who was brutally assaulted in broad daylight in Times Square. And just a few days ago, following a series of terrorist attacks murdering 11 Israelis, there were activists calling for, quote, Zionist professors and students to be purged. And the context of those comments was a march known as Globalize the Intifada, which to me is an incitement to commit more anti-Semitic violence.
There's a sense that Mayor Adams ran and won with crucial support from a diverse, working class, lower middle class coalition in the outer boroughs that had different sensibilities, different priorities than a lot of Democrats who've gained prominence, a lot of urban Democrats who've gained prominence in the national discourse. And there's also a sense that you, in your district in the South Bronx, are also representing this more pragmatic, more blue-collar outer borough coalition. Can you tell us a bit about whether or not you think that's right, that there is this real coalition within the Democratic Party, both in New York City and nationally? And if so, what do you see as the priorities of this coalition?
Well, the coalition that elected Eric Adams as mayor is the same coalition that elected Joe Biden as president. These are the voters who represent the heart and soul of the Democratic Party. Black and brown voters, many of them are moderate voters. And most Democrats in New York City, including in the South Bronx, are practical, not ideological, tend to be moderate rather than radical in their politics, and tend to focus on bread and butter issues, schools, jobs, safety, housing. And Eric Adams won on a platform that spoke powerfully to the bread and butter issues that weigh heavily on everyday New Yorkers. These tend to be the voters who are unrepresented on Twitter. I believe about a year ago, the Pew Research Center came out with a study indicating that 75% of Americans never tweet. And yet in politics, we tend to mistake the visible vocal minority on Twitter for a majority of New Yorkers and a majority of the American people. And what I find refreshing about Eric Adams is that he refuses to govern in reaction to or out of fear of the Twitter mob. He does what he thinks is right. He says what he believes. And that is a refreshing contrast to what not only New York City, but American politics has become.
Let's pivot to economic growth. Are we seeing enough growth and jobs in the outer boroughs right now, including in places like your district in the South Bronx?
There has been a slow road to recovery in the wake of COVID. On the subject of development, in my view, the NIMBYism of the political establishment has had a chilling effect on development in New York City. The two most egregious examples, Amazon, the collapse of Amazon in 2019 and the collapse of Industry City in 2020. Amazon would have generated $27 billion in revenue and somewhere between 25 and 100,000 jobs. Industry City would have generated thousands of jobs, and the city council chose to derail Industry City during a pandemic in the midst of depression-level unemployment. I'm a proud Democrat who is proudly a product of the social safety net, the social contract. But the reality is the social contract does not pay for itself. It requires economic growth. It requires the revenues that come from economic growth. And I hope that the city can adopt a more thoughtful approach to development.
One big topic right now is infrastructure. Congress passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and there's a lot of enthusiasm about what that legislation might mean for New York City. How should New York City channel the dollars coming our way?
Well, I was proud to vote for the bipartisan infrastructure investment, which is going to be, I think, a massive infusion into the infrastructure of New York City. Of particular interest to me is Penn Station access in the Bronx, the Metro North expansion. So for about a century, the Hell Gate line, which is owned by Amtrak for about half a century, has cut through the Bronx without actually servicing the Bronx. And so Penn Station access is an opportunity to leverage the Hell Gate line for the benefit of the Bronx. It would establish 4 new Metro North stations in Co-op City, Hunts Point, Parkchester, Van Nest. And I believe that project is going to fundamentally strengthen the Bronx economy. It's going to lead to faster commutes and deeper connections to the employment and economic and education centers, not only in Manhattan, but also in Westchester County and Connecticut. So that's the kind of project that's going to move forward more expeditiously because of some of the federal dollars flowing into New York City. I've been heavily focused on the Cross Bronx Expressway. The Empire State Development Agency Corporation once reported that there are about 15,000 truck trips from and to the Hunts Point terminal market. And those trucks heavily create massive congestion on the Cross Bronx Expressway. And if you're a child who lives near the Cross Bronx or you attend school near the Cross Bronx, you are breathing in through no fault of your own massive amounts of particulate matter, massive amounts of pollutants that can cause respiratory diseases like asthma. It's no coincidence that the South Bronx has among the highest rates of asthma hospitalization in the city. And so there is a vision for capping the Cross Bronx with a deck park and then installing electrostatic filters that would prevent the particulate matter, the pollutants, from recirculating in the air. Chuck Schumer and I secured millions of dollars for a feasibility study to determine whether it could be done and how much it would cost. And that process will unfold over the next 2 years. So those are 2 examples of projects that might gain momentum as a result of the bipartisan infrastructure investment.
Congressman Torres, you've identified a number of very worthy projects, but you've also at times acknowledged that New York City suffers from some of the highest public infrastructure costs, not just in the United States, but in the world. I wonder if you think that there are any useful strategies to pursue to help address that crisis of high infrastructure costs. There is this real sense that we spend and spend and spend, yet we get very little of value from that spending due to a thicket of regulations, due to just a variety of political complexities in which it almost seems as though infrastructure projects are seen as an opportunity to buy off various constituencies rather than an opportunity to actually get high quality, sustainable infrastructure for our communities.
Yeah, Francis Fukuyama has a wonderful term, I think, vetocracy, government by veto. I feel like much of the public review process in New York City often feels like vetocracy masquerading as democracy. But the process of public review can be so burdensome that it raises the cost of construction and development in New York City. One of the greatest barriers to affordable housing development is certainly the zoning code. The zoning code, not only here in New York City, but especially elsewhere in the country, often has a structural bias against multifamily development. And then here in New York City, the property tax code has a real bias against multifamily housing development. So the land use process, the property tax code, the zoning code, all of these have made development much more expensive than it should be.
You represent a district that I believe is the highest poverty urban district in the United States. And over the course of your career in Congress, one piece of legislation that you've really championed is the expansion of the child credit, part of the larger Build Back Better package. Now, as we know, the Build Back Better package is stalled, and there is a widespread belief that it might not actually see the light of day. Representing a very high poverty district, do you feel as though constituents like yours are not getting appropriate weight within the politics of the Democratic coalition in Congress? Is your sense that there are other projects that were prioritized over something like child credit expansion that you've championed, and that therefore led to the failure of that effort?
I'm not clear that I would attribute the expiration of the child tax credit to a lack of prioritization. It did feel to me, so I wrote an op-ed in favor of the child tax credit well before the American Rescue Plan, which expanded the child tax credit, which cut child poverty by 50%. And I certainly felt then that there was a lack of prioritization. But since the American Rescue Plan, I think the party has seen the value of expanding the child tax credit and putting more money in the pockets of the lowest income families who are going to spend those dollars locally, who are going to stimulate the local economy. And the cost of living has become prohibitively expensive for the lowest income families. And the child tax credit enables more people to have money to put food on the table and to pay their bills and to keep themselves afloat. And the head of households of these families are often the same essential workers who put their lives at risk during the peak of the pandemic so that the rest of the city could safely shelter in place. And we owe it to those workers to ensure that New York City remains affordable to them.
You're a product of the Bronx, born and bred, and you've said before that your motto in life is, if you do nothing, nothing will change. What must change in the Bronx, and indeed in New York City, in your mind?
Well, what we need in the Bronx and in New York City and in the United States is more pragmatic leadership. I think we need public servants who are serious about solving problems rather than performing on Twitter. I think the need for more pragmatic leadership would be a massive improvement for the Bronx, for the city, and for the country.
How do you see the partnership between the New York City congressional delegation and Mayor Adams as it stands?
Look, the mayor has said to the congressional delegation from day one that he cannot succeed on his own. He needs the support of legislators in Albany, and he needs the support of those of us in Washington, D.C. And we're committed to supporting the mayor's agenda. We've brought unprecedented resources to New York City under the leadership of the Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer. And frankly, no matter who's the mayor, the New York City congressional delegation sees itself as the lobby for New York City in Washington, D.C. And we're going to lobby aggressively for the best interest of the city, regardless of who's serving as mayor.
You've not been shy about calling out the Democratic Socialists of America as a force that has been counterproductive in your efforts to craft a more pragmatic progressivism. Yet you also said earlier on that, essentially you see no prospects for revising New York City's bail law. Do you believe it is right and appropriate for Mayor Adams and other political figures in New York City and New York State who do embrace a more pragmatic progressivism to start contemplating primary challenges against lawmakers in Albany who are unwilling to take a more pragmatic view of how we ought to approach revising the bail law to update them in light of recent events and the recent upsurge in crime?
I'm not clear I'm going to advocate for primary challenges to my colleagues in government. At some level, I do believe that we should be a pluralistic party, a big tent party, where we allow and respect and even celebrate a diversity of opinion. So I would be careful I would be hesitant to advocate for primary challenges against my colleagues at the local, state, or even federal level.
You've spoken about the notion of pragmatic progressivism. What defines that brand in your mind? What do you find compelling about that? And do you see it resonating with the kind of younger cohorts of Democrats in Congress?
Well, look, at some level, I try to resist the temptation to label because I ultimately prefer to be judged as an individual and as an independent thinker. But I've come to identify myself variously as a liberal rather than a leftist Democrat or a pragmatic progressive. And for me, pragmatic progressive means taking an empirical rather than ideological approach to governing. It means, harnessing the power of both government and the markets to solve problems. I think much of the affordable housing that we create is the product of public-private partnership, and I consider that to be a pragmatic, progressive enterprise. It means creating an environment where we all can do well and do good at the same time. And it's, I think, based on a fundamental belief in the American project of building a more perfect union. For me, one of the best definitions of what I would consider pragmatic progressivism came from Bill Clinton, who said in one of his inaugural addresses, "There's nothing that's wrong with America that cannot be cured by what is right with America." And I believe we should harness what is best in our country, the ingenuity of our country, to fix what might be broken and to correct what might be wrong.
Congressman Torres, what do you consider the highest legislative priority for New York City and Congress between now and the end of the term?
That's a hard question to answer. Certainly in New York City, public safety is front and center. One of my highest priorities would be an expansion of the child tax credit, because the families in the South Bronx are struggling mightily with higher prices at the gas pumps and in the supermarkets, and inflation has taken a real toll on the people I represent in the South Bronx. So there's a whole range of priorities. It's hard to say that one is more important than the others.
Congressman Torres, thank you so much for your time. It's a great pleasure to talk to you, and we're so honored that you were here to join us. And with that, it's now my great honor to introduce Errol Lewis for his keynote address, after which our own Michael Hendrix will come up to moderate a discussion with Errol and Alyssa Katz. Errol is the political anchor of Spectrum News New York One, where he hosts Inside City Hall and the podcast You Decide. He also writes a weekly column for New York Magazine and teaches urban reporting at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY. And without further ado, Errol Lewis.
How you doing? Good to see you. Okay, thank you very much, Reihan. And I want to express thanks to the Manhattan Institute for inviting me to speak with you this afternoon and help get this conversation started. It has been a while since we had a chance to talk. I think the last time that I remember was an extraordinary discussion about how to deal with serious mental illness. The panel included our late friend DJ Jaffe, whose voice is very much missed today. I remember that same panel included Judge Matthew Demick of the Brooklyn Mental Health Court. I've been asked to share some thoughts about the first 100 days of the Eric Adams administration. And let me say up front, I have no inside information for you. I have yet to sit down with Mayor Adams to share what I want to say to you today or to hear his responses. I do hope he will take me up on a long-standing invitation to join us for a few minutes on Inside City Hall. But I have a couple of questions for the administration and for all of us, which I hope will help set the tone and get today's discussion started. Question one, is the administration committed to the 100 Steps Forward for New York City? That's a campaign document, you may remember, that laid out a wide range of assumptions and a number of promises, some of them explicit, some of them implicit, of specific actions that the administration would take if he was elected. It was reported recently that the document disappeared from the campaign's website, although our friends at the Gotham Gazette have helpfully reposted a copy of it, so you can find it online. Now, some of the 100 steps have in fact been taken, like getting more uniformed officers out from behind desks and onto street patrols. There was also a promise or a point in that 100 points to appoint an efficiency czar to streamline and coordinate government services. That has been done as well. But those 100 steps also include things like imposing an income tax surcharge on New Yorkers who make over $5 million a year. It includes imposing a 2-year hiring freeze on city workers. It includes implementing a weekly tax holiday in which the sales tax would be suspended every Tuesday. Now, I don't know and I don't remember seeing many of those items in the mayor's preliminary budget. There's still time, of course, to make that part of the conversation, but those items might never be mentioned again. There's a notable absence, I should say, of a plan for CUNY, which, as a longtime adjunct at the School of Journalism, sort of concerned me. CUNY, with 270,000 students, is a major driver of current and future employment for working families in our city, and clearly ought to be part of whatever discussion goes forward, both about higher education and about economic development in New York. So now some of you may like or hate the various 100 points in that proposal, but we should know, and the administration, I think, needs to decide whether these are going to be marching orders for the deputy mayors and the commissioners, or if they're going to be adjusted or canceled or forgotten, or more likely superseded by reality. A second question, which is related, do we have a flexible and dynamic and learning organization leading City Hall? In his book, Healthy at Last, Mayor Adams talks about waking up in 2016, suddenly unable to see, and panicked due to what he eventually discovered was a severe case of diabetes, high cholesterol, and high blood pressure that was literally killing him. He had an A1C level of 17. For those in the room who know what that means and just gasped, the recommended top reading is 7. That indicates diabetes. So Eric Adams, who was then the borough president, sought out experts on diet and wellness, took himself out to the Cleveland Clinic and other places, and promptly shifted to a whole foods, plant-based diet. He lost 35 pounds within 2 months and reversed his diabetes diagnosis a few months after that. Very impressive. And I raise that only to say that the future mayor could have responded to the onset of a severe case of diabetes that was literally killing him by eating less of a toxic diet, or by frantically exercising more, or by treating the symptoms with a range of insulin and other drugs that the pharmaceutical industry would have happily sold to him. But it was a case, according to Eric Adams, where the best choice was to address the underlying conditions directly. I think that the mayor's journey to wellness is fundamental to his public personality and his governing style. He frequently talks about not feeding a broken system. He talks about taking steps like serving healthier school lunches instead of trying to deal with childhood obesity on the back end. He talks about making a frontal attack on literacy and poor math skills in the early grades in order to close the achievement gap and lower the high school dropout rate. And on a daily basis, he repeats the mantra that got him elected, that public safety is the prerequisite to economic prosperity. So now I think that the best parts of these first 100 days and the wisest use of the potent but limited powers of any New York City mayor will be expressed when the administration sticks to strategies that address underlying conditions that predated this administration and frankly predated the current pandemic. The places where the administration is likely to hit bumps in the road, I think, is when it resorts to short-term tactics that address symptoms rather than causes. And obviously, there are no absolutes here. New York has an elaborate emergency response system. The public has every right to expect prompt action rather than philosophical debate when it comes to things like public safety and other urgent life or death matters. But one of the most important lessons, I think, of Eric Adams' journey to personal wellness is that he sought out expertise, and then he consistently applied what many would have considered proven but unorthodox strategies, and he quickly saw positive results. If this city administration approaches its challenges with the same combination of curiosity, willingness to adapt, and persistence, I think it is likely to find great success, and we should all hope for that. But to put it simply, as you get on with this afternoon of important and informed discussions, and you surface new information, and you put new perspectives out there, the real question on the table is anybody at City Hall listening? And I guess finally, I'd add, kind of 2A, another question I would put out there, just because we'll probably talk about it in the media section, but I think it's so much out there. The question the way I would phrase it is, are there practical limits to the mayor's commitment to using emotional intelligence and empathy, both as a governing style and as a filter and a screen and a requirement for selecting his leadership team? I recently, Mr. Adams attributed his victory in the Democratic primary to the fact that he said the other candidates that he beat wanted people to know what they thought. He wanted people to know how he felt. Now, I remember the campaign a little bit differently, but he won, so let's take him at his word. It works powerfully well. I don't think anyone who spent any time looking at it will soon forget the powerful mix of emotions that went into the two police funerals for the officers who were assassinated shortly after the mayor was sworn in. It's important for the mayor as a symbolic leader to be there and to walk as he did with his with the officers that he leads to make a statement to the public and to the world and to the criminal class about the determination with which his administration is going to restore public safety in our city. On the other hand, I recently ran into the mayor quite by accident at LaGuardia Airport. We happened to both be on the same flight going out to Chicago a couple of weeks ago. And as we were flying, there, as often is the case, there was some turbulence. And I remember thinking at the time, I wouldn't want the pilot, the co-pilot, or the navigator to come back and sit in the seats with us and experience the turbulence with us and empathize with us about what a bumpy, scary ride it had suddenly turned into. I want them in the cockpit, hands on the controls, getting information about weather conditions or whatever else it is they need to know to land the plane safely. So every time I see the mayor out at the various atrocities, the murders, the stabbings, the beatings, the hate crimes that predated this administration, will continue throughout this administration, and sadly will continue into the future, I wonder to myself, is there a limit to that? Is there a practical limit to that? I think he should know by now, we get it. He feels what we feel. That's why we elected him mayor. He knows what turbulence feels like. That's why he's in the cockpit. And so I just put it out there as a question. As a governing style, as a requirement for his leadership team, do we want them in the cockpit? Do we want them in the back with us? Is that going to become an issue at some point? And I wish I was enough of an ideologue to give you answers to all of these questions, but I am not. I don't have answers for you. I only have questions. It's what I do for a living. And I hope this has been helpful in trying to sort of put out there for you something of what I think we're all going to have to grapple with. You know, the good news, of course, is that this is the second sort of half to full day event that I've been a part of dedicated to trying to figure out how to help this administration succeed. It's a level of goodwill that, frankly, either it didn't happen or it escaped me back in 2014 when the last administration was getting organized. I'm not sure they would have listened anyway. They very much had a lot of answers. But again, those three questions. Do the 100 points matter? Are those our marching orders? Or is something new happening? Is this a learning administration? Is this a learning organization? Are they open to whatever it is we say today or what you might surface in the weeks to come? And then thirdly, can we have we reached or will we reach the limits of what empathy can provide? And where does analysis come in? Where does policy come in? How will that be set? And how will that be advanced in the weeks and months to come? Hope that is helpful to you. I'll be on the media panel. And thanks so much for being here today.
Errol, thank you so much for that incredible appetizer, the main course actually for the discussion. Really an honor to be with you here today. especially with you, and also to introduce Alyssa Katz. Alyssa is deputy editor at The City. It's a local newsroom, nonprofit newsroom by New Yorkers, for New Yorkers. You live in Brooklyn, also hate the passive voice, I believe, is from bio. Yeah. We're here to discuss getting stuff done. This is what Reihan mentioned at the beginning, was something that Mayor Adams said we should look for, getting something done. What does that mean? What has he gotten done? What should we want the administration to get done in the days to come? You raised amazing questions, Errol, and I want to address many of them here and really begin to flesh them out. So you talked about the 100 points. Will it be a learning administration, the limits of empathy? But Errol, I want to stick with you for just a moment, too, to zoom out a little bit. What has really stood out to you in the first 100 days? Moments, images, words that he's spoken? What really stands out to you? What comes to mind?
I think something that has stood out for me is that the mayor has tried, very much in contrast to the prior administration, to be everywhere, to do something similar to what Ed Katz used to do. He'd pop up all kinds of places, and Giuliani to a certain extent. Giuliani would show up at fires. Giuliani would show up at shootings. He would show up at different events where his presence was not particularly needed, but he thought it was important to show the city that he was on the job. That to me is very striking, because we just had 8 years of a mayor who, within weeks of taking office, was on the road and let it be known that he thought he had something to say. Now, we do have a mayor who likes to sort of globetrot a little bit, but at the same time, it's kind of offset by this real sort of a presence at a lot of different places.
And sometimes those moments find him, right? First day in office, he's riding the subway, and he has to call in a police report, right? There's a fight going on. That was like an incredible moment. He goes out and finds opportunities, opportunities find him. Alyssa, do you see the same things?
Well, I think what Errol's describing, what you're describing, are all part of very, very careful brand management that I think has really defined the Adams persona and administration so far. And I know I very much feel this as a journalist and as an editor, where we are, in trying to cover the administration, consistently confronted with Adams wants to tell the story in his own way. He doesn't want anyone else defining the agenda, to the point where when we asked all the mayoral candidates to fill out a survey so that we could create what I hoped was a very helpful decision engine for voters. Who do you want to vote for? Here's some simple questions. We made it multiple choice questions, and Adams essentially refused to participate, said, no, we don't want to give you the answers that you're looking for. We don't want to be pinned down on these issues. So I think that's what we've seen, the intense bursts of 5, 6, 7 TV appearances back to back on national TV, him consistently trying to control the media cycle by putting out stories that he wants, and doing it not usually in the Blue Room at City Hall, but going out around the city so that the reporters have to chase him and are so busy following his narrative, his trajectory, whatever that agenda is for that day, that there's really not so much else they can do to watchdog the administration. So I think it's really about his brand as get stuff done, around his messaging, around fighting crime, bringing New York City back, just hitting those themes again and again.
Is that a window into his management style? So, if there's great message control, maybe centralization, if you're going to reach out to a particular department as a journalist, maybe it has to be routed through City Hall. Does it give you a window into how he runs City Hall?
Well, I mean,
or his team does?
Well, I mean, and again, seeing this through the media lens, we've seen Politico and City and State have had stories this week around how basically any communication between the press and city agencies needs to get routed through City Hall. And this is a real point of potential concern. Like, on the one hand, this happens a lot with government leaders. Governor Cuomo kind of infamously acted in pretty much the same way, but it managed to kind of bottle up a lot of stories or questions that were unfriendly to the administration. But here with Adams, I mean, again, we have just found it can be very difficult to get answers to really simple questions, even when they're very friendly to the administration. And so I think that's, again, through my very narrow lens as a journalist, it tells me that, look, it's a young administration. It's just not even 100 days yet. We're giving them plenty of space and time to figure things out, but it is a concern if that is how agencies are being run, is through a bottleneck at City Hall, and they can't even respond to a question without getting permission from the mayor's office. That's going to be a structural problem.
It's a mistake. It's a mistake. I mean, look, politically speaking, it's understandable. You want message discipline. You want to put out your story of the day. Understanding in New York that something is going to happen. Something's going to blow up, or something's going to blow over, or something's going to happen. Again, understandable. I would say it works until it doesn't. And the reason it doesn't work, ultimately, is that it's really a two-way communication. And nobody at City Hall will ever believe this. Not this administration, not any administration. But the reality is, we in the media are trying to bring information to them. It's supposed to be a two-way communication. And administrations that don't want to listen, don't want to hear, don't want to learn, are really passing up an amazing resource. We have reporters out in the neighborhoods talking to people that the administration says they care about and are supposed to be serving, but are not talking to government officials. They'll talk to us. And if you think back over the last few administrations, both at the state and the local level, there are key blind spots that people in the media were trying to alert the administration to. Mayor Bloomberg, the media, tried to explain to him the stop and frisk is out of control. We understand what you're trying to do. We're glad that the numbers are dropping. We understand that Ray Kelly has a lot of experience, but this is not working. You are stopping more people, you are stopping more young men of color than exist in certain precincts, like the 73rd precinct in Brownsville. You can't keep doing this. And it took, ultimately, a lawsuit, a federal lawsuit. Same thing with desegregating the fire department. We kept telling them, I mean, I'm saying this personally, I used to tell them, I'm like, look, you need to do something about this. You can't just let this go on. If they are not listening, it comes back in really negative ways. It happened with Giuliani. It was like, look, we understand that you're not a friend of the civil rights establishment. They have a lot to answer for. They're not always honest brokers and so forth. But you need to deal with them, especially after Amadou Diallo was shot with 41 bullets. You're at a crisis point. And it wasn't until they brought the whole city, or the police department in particular, to a halt that he finally got it. So, I wish and I hope that this administration will be open. I'll give you an example. I mean, I said this on the air, so I'm not keeping any secrets. If you read the last Federal Monitor's report about the conditions on Rikers Island, they are heading in a straight line to a federal takeover of the New York City jails. It's been done in other jurisdictions. It's ugly. It's awful. It's probably the worst of all possible outcomes. But we're on our way there. I don't know if the administration, that's never going to be their issue of the day. Their message discipline is not going to include anything resembling that. In fact, what we've seen the mayor do is talk about dangerousness, changing the age of criminal responsibility, and other factors that will actually feed more people into a completely broken down institution called the Department of Correction. That's going to have to be worked on. That's going to have to be fixed. I say it here. I'd say it to the mayor if I was alone with him in an airplane lounge. I'd say it to anybody. Again, the question is, are they listening?
So I want to get into policy specifics and specific issue areas, but I do want to stay on management style for just a little bit, because I feel it does inform what getting stuff done looks like, what is possible to get done. So Errol, and then also to you, what mayors in the past does this mayor resemble? And who should he look to from the past as models? I mean, you've met many of them, come to know them very well.
Yeah, I think he wants to have the panache of Ed Koch and the management chops of Mike Bloomberg. And the compassionate heart of David Dinkins.
You agree, Alyssa? Yeah.
I do. Yeah. I mean, plus, of course, the sort of law enforcement credentials of Rudy Giuliani,
right.
And
right.
I
all
think,
four. Yeah.
So this is sort of a best of, right? We'll just get all of them together.
But I think this is a very important point, because I think the city right now, while the sort of fundamentals of the mayor's job involves making sure, sort of the points that Errol and I both hit on, making sure you're present, making sure that you have a strong handle on crime, making sure that you have some mastery mastery a la Bloomberg of the kind of data fundamentals and policy, all of that, and the empathy of Dinkins. And at the same time, we're at a point in history where nothing from the past can really give the playbook for what to do now, right? I mean, he's managed to maybe stabilize the city, although as Congressman Torres pointed out, I mean, we're no safer now than 100 days ago, right? I think that's a really important point. And this is a mayor at a moment where he's got to really figure out how to bring New York, as to use your metaphor, back to health, but really imagine a path to a future. So he's clearly a very good scholar of the past and has reflected on leadership in New York. But I think the question now is, how do you lead sort of beyond the day-to-day news cycle, the day-to-day, okay, we'll have this initiative this day on getting youth in foster care jobs, and we'll have our crime program today, and he's been in that mode all along. And I think the question now becomes, how does he get into, as a leader, the sort of complexities of what it will really take to get New York back, including, not to jump ahead, but to relationship with Albany. What does that look like?
Well, actually, that's a great question, because maybe this is kind of the final question, this theme of style and management, but what have we seen of his relationship with both Albany, broadly, and the governor herself, especially now during the budget season?
Well, I mean, as my news site reported, I mean, he showed up literally once, and multiple people. And
how does it, by the way, how does that compare to, like, what's what's normal?
You might know better than me.
Well, I mean, normally they'd go up a couple of times. They'd go up at the certainly for State of the State, right? That sort of a thing, and then
and hold out the tin cup and.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, and it was always an interesting sight to see Mike Bloomberg up there, having to not quite bow and scrape, but having to put up with a lot of dumb questions, and if you've ever been there, these old Rockefeller era hearing rooms, where all of the legislators are way up here in what looks like this big Soviet-style, modernist, kind of horrible tribunal setting, and the mayor of New York is sitting there, like to be scolded like a child, which many state senators and assembly members will specifically do, because that's what they like to do.
So I believe Adams did that visit virtually this time, and then
from the back of his car. Right?
And then showed up exactly once. But I think the most telling detail was that he did not present, I believe it was his bail reform and discovery reform, his vaunted criminal justice plan, which, remember, he announced back in January, what he was going to do to really deal with crime in New York. He presented it the day after the budget would have had to be due in order to be seasoned for 3 days to be voted on in time, right? So in other words, he was late in even getting in his recommendation, which to me was shocking, but very telling. And I think that's what Albany leaders have said about it.
He does have seems like a good working relationship with the governor.
I would say yes, although there's a time limit on that, and whatever the date of the June primary is probably when that's going to expire. The mayor, like every mayor, and the governor, like every governor, they are structurally kind of antagonistic on some level, right? The mayor's always going to ask for more than the governor wants to give. The governor has much bigger concerns than the mayor. The mayor gets all of the glitz and the glamour and the media attention, and the governor actually has more power. So you've got all of the ingredients for what's going to be an ugly clash. And it was true with Rockefeller and Lindsay, and it was true for Cuomo and Dinkins, and it was, on and on and on. So right now, it's in everybody's best interest for the two of them to get along for political reasons. Until Governor Hochul is confident that she's going to win re-election, she will be trying to do favors for the city of New York and its voters. Because running up the numbers here in the city is the only way, or the surest way, for her to get re-elected.
So stay tuned. Keep watch.
Yes, that's right. Well, I mean, look. As a New York City resident, I hope the mayor takes everything that's not tied down, because after this election, it's going to be a very different story.
Alyssa, so I want to pivot to some policy specifics, and as a gateway to that, talk about the greatest challenges facing the city. So back up a little bit. What do you see as the greatest challenges facing the city? Is it crime? Obviously, it's on top of every poll I see out there among voters, but also there's a jobs crisis, there's the fate of Midtown. What are the greatest challenges, and does the Adams administration see the same see it the same way?
Yeah, so I mean, all of these challenges you're describing, I cannot pick one because they are so fundamentally interrelated, right? And and more so, it is the challenge of both, it's the dual challenge of really healing what is a very traumatized and wounded city. I mean, we cannot forget, like, 40,000 people died? 40,000. Children in high school, still wear masks to school even though they don't have to, and even though there's barely any COVID there, because they're terrified that they're going to get it or spread it, right? I mean, this is just these kind of daily indicators we have in our lives. And so he has to make New Yorkers who are here feel confident about the future, that there will be something better up ahead, and really define, like, what is the purpose of New York City now? Because historically, we have, whether it's been as a port or as a center of commerce, there's always been a reason geographically for New York to not only exist but thrive. And there's a giant question mark over all of that. And so I think, he had started by trying to get New York, get people to go back to the office and really making that a priority. But in a way, that's sort of both kind of futile. People are, the world has changed, and him saying it isn't going to change that. And it's I think ultimately he's going to have to get the public safety and the culture and climate in Manhattan and in the boroughs to a place where people will actually have a quality of life here that makes being in New York worth it when you don't have to be here. And I think he really just has to solve for that problem on every front.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, to me, the big question on the table is, can we hold the city together? And this is something we all worry about all the time. And, I understand, I've seen enough turns of the cycle here, and I knew it was all over, it was supposed to all be over after 2001, right, after 9/11. It was all supposed to be over after the fiscal crisis in the mid-'70s. It was all supposed to be over when austerity was, sort of driving services down in the 1980s, and on and on and on and on. So I don't, though, want to lapse into the lazy triumphalism that so many of us have, which is that, well, it's New York. You want to go to Kansas, go to Kansas. You want to go to London, go to London. You want to go to San Francisco where the weather's nice, go to San Francisco. At some point, the numbers don't lie. This latest spat with the governor of Florida, for example. My wife's from Florida, my mom's from Florida, got a lot of family in Florida. I've written about how if you retire as a city worker on an average salary, the mere fact that you don't have to pay income tax on it means it makes a lot of sense to go to this place that has, great weather, and they'll take less of your money. And after 10 years, it actually starts to look like real money. You can save $50,000, $100,000 just by moving down there. I think that's real. It's real. We've never even had not to my satisfaction, I don't even think we've had the right conversation about who can leave. Whenever that comes up, there's a very loud voice that will say, hey, let them go to the Hamptons, let them go to Palm Beach. But that's not who's leaving in the first place, right? I mean, who's leaving in the first place are the retired city workers who don't, who want to make their $80,000 go a little bit further, right? So they move to Florida. And there's enough of an installed base down there that they can even hang with other New Yorkers if that's what they want to do. I think, though, the more serious and immediate problem with can we hold this together is that, the immigrant working class of this city, who were never treated all that well, I think what happened in the pandemic really sort of exposed a crying and urgent need to do a better job of integrating them into the life of this city, to treat them with dignity and respect and decent wages. The issue, it might even have been your story, that really sort of brought a lot of it together for me was discovering that the deliveristas, the folks who had been bringing us food for 2.5 years, were not allowed to use the bathrooms at the restaurants from which they were picking up the food, which seemed to me like stupid and cruel and unnecessary on multiple levels. And it shouldn't have had to take the city council passing a law to stop that from happening, but they did. We need to have, I wish we didn't need to have that happen, but that's an extreme version or a notable and obvious version of a much larger question that I think we all have to deal with. It's not up to just the administration. I certainly wouldn't trust it to the city council, but we all have to, I think, be part of that conversation and create a municipal culture that is much more tolerant and welcoming that provides a lot more opportunity. I mean, that's, what this is.
Sort of at all income levels, all sort of wealth and background.
Of course. I mean, look, the thing that makes us, to me, the thing that makes us all equal is everybody's ambitious, right? The cab driver who, came from the Middle East and was an engineer over there, but is driving a cab here, is just as ambitious as the kid who just got out of B school and wants to make $100 million, right? And they're just as ambitious as the poets and the dancers and the artists who are working 3 jobs to get their shot at Broadway or whatever it might be. If we can not just celebrate it and not just give it rhetorical support, but give it real support, then I think we'll be getting somewhere.
But I do think this gets right to the question of we have a very high unemployment rate now, as Reihan was saying earlier, and we have an incredibly divided economy, right, where unemployment is being hugely felt within the service industries, within people who are not college educated, in the outer boroughs, and we need, and Adams has been very good so far at laying groundwork and recognizing that this is an issue, recognizing that we need to support businesses. He made an announcement today in Brooklyn. I think that's been really, really strong. He also wisely did not appoint someone for the Economic Development Corporation who happened to be a crony, and actually appointed somebody, Andrew Kimball, who knows what he's doing. Yeah. So that is also good. But the point being that that's I think a sort of necessary but not sufficient path toward rebuilding the economy for working New Yorkers. I think the more fundamental issue is getting at something revealed in this deliverista situation, which is that we have an economy that is so driven by companies like Amazon, like DoorDash, right? Like that are used to being able to, in much of the country and world, being able to or trying to call the shots and really leverage their power over workers, particularly immigrants who are disadvantaged and often undocumented and really not in a great situation in that sense. And really figuring out, New York has been a leader, certainly in recent years and historically, in creating those pathways to opportunity. And as we just saw with the Amazon workers in Staten Island, saying, you know what, you're going to do business a little bit differently here, because we are a city where opportunity is shared widely. It's not hoarded by just a few people. And I think that's an important thing for Adams to get right.
And I'm glad you pointed that out, because even though crime is definitely at the top of people's agenda, and certainly at the top of the mayor's agenda, the jobs crisis is real. I mean, you've done reporting on this at the city, you and your colleagues. And it's really just astonishing how far behind the city is, and how uniquely concentrated some of that job loss is, both in certain industries, but also geographically, including up in the Bronx, where Congressman Torres is from. But back to your point, Errol, on what makes for a city where people want to stay, or for a city where people want to move to actually come to New York City. It seems like housing is certainly an issue. Some people have been saying, Alyssa, you kind of brought this up, some people are saying, like, there's nothing really to be worried about. Errol, you brought this up too, the city always bounces back. People are now also saying, look at rents. Rents are back up again, so like, why are we so worried? There's another way, of course, that you could look at that. Like, you should be worried that rents are back up again, right, and incredibly expensive, and that seems tough for workers.
Yeah, no, it is tough. I mean, rents are right back to where they were pre-pandemic, and employment is not. And by the way, at the height of the pandemic, I think there was something like 150,000 jobs that were on offer that were not getting filled. So, we had a structural mismatch between openings and skills, or whatever the problem might have been, that predated and ran right through the entire pandemic. We now have the Great Resignation and some of the effects of that, where certain kinds of workers are bargaining a little bit harder. We just saw what happened with the Amazon workers. Some people are not going to put up with what's on offer to them. And, it's some of that is supply and demand. We know it's a national or even international phenomenon at this point, and that just makes it a little bit more turbulent. But there was always a problem. There was a problem even before the last few years. What this administration, like every administration, needs to do, I think, is be much more intentional about trying to sort of close that gap and make those matches happen, and make this a city where look, the affordability of housing is fundamental. You can't get anything else done if people can't afford to live here. I tend to also think of it as a transportation issue, because if you have decent transportation, you can live pretty far out into Long Island. You can live pretty far out into Jersey or even Westchester. You know, I mean, I grew up in southern Westchester in New Rochelle. If you can get a fast train to Port Chester, you can still work in New York. If you can get a decent, you know, form of transportation to Elmont or Newark or, you know, a number of different places, you can be in the game. We're not used to thinking regionally. Again, the mayor has severely limited powers. There's things he can't do other than try and persuade and organize. But that's what this mayor said he was going to do. And if we can at least get that conversation going, I think, you know, I should also say, some of the economic development stuff that we're hearing from the mayor, I haven't looked through the program that he released today, but some of what he's doing, the thing he announced at Kingsborough College, which is, you know, a community college-based employment for kids coming out of foster care, which is like a direct feeder into, you know, homeless shelters and jails and every other bad thing if you don't catch these kids when they're about to become emancipated. That's brilliant. That's good stuff. That's breaking down silos. That's making sure, you know, ACS is talking to CUNY, and, you know, you can make some really great things happen. What he announced at the Harbor School, where he took a couple of hundred kids over to what he wants to be a hub for making wind turbines, you know, in Sunset Park. Great stuff, really good stuff. Like, a lot more of that is needed. And I think it provides dividends, not in the next decade, although it will, but I think it starts to prove out fairly quickly. And so the more of that he does, I think the better off the administration will be.
Yeah, I would just be remiss in not mentioning as a kind of a drag on the economy, and I think one factor in why job creation has been lagging here is the sort of uncertainty about the COVID landscape, right? And it's whichever way you look at it. Either you're somebody who wants more restrictions and you're unsure if it's going to be safe, or you look at what the Adams administration has been saying and doing, right? Where you have a continuation, for example, of the private employer vaccine mandate as well as the government vaccine mandate, but with an exception for Kyrie Irving. And then the continued masking of toddlers, where you have parents actively seeking to leave town because they can't live another day with their child living in a way that makes the parent upset. And a really kind of thin, if even that, public health justification, but that Adams has been doubling down on. So there's always this kind of concern, like, will New York shut down again? Adams has actually explicitly warned about that. If we don't mask our toddlers, we may have to shut the city down. He's actually connected those thoughts. And I get what he's getting at, right? We always should be thoughtful about how we respond to COVID, but he's really pushing that button, and the climate of fear is really continued, and he needs to be better at not whipping up those fears.
So we'll be turning to questions shortly, so get them ready. We want to hear from you as well. But what should we be looking for over the next, and I had this down because I couldn't remember, 1,361 days? That's after April 11th. April 11th is day 100. So for the next 1,361 days, what should we be looking for? What are you looking for in the Adams administration?
I'm going to look closely at the executive budget and maybe compare it to those 100 points. Try and get a better fix on whether or not that's a real operating document. Campaign promises, I know enough of you know enough about this that, whether it's the White House or the Executive Mansion in Albany or City Hall, people are given a booklet of, when in doubt, make sure you're meeting these promises because we're going to have to answer for this when the re-election campaign begins. Are they really doing that with the 100 points or not? That is something I'm going to look for in the medium term. There have been enough conflict of interest type issues that have been raised throughout the administration that's an evergreen sort of permanent duty of us in the media to sort of try and connect dots and make sure that, different procurements and appointments and other kind of government management tools are not being misused.
Yeah, Errol, you just said exactly what I was going to say, but to elaborate on both those points, I think a crucial thing to look for with Adams and the budget is to see how the relationship with the new city council plays out, and particularly the council is kind of, as it does, this is normal, right, bidding up the budget to rather extraordinary degrees. I think Nicole Gelinas, who will be speaking later, wrote a good column about that this week. And, in certain questions around, again, Adams has deviated from his own blueprint, like, for example, on affordable housing. He said he would double capital investment in affordable housing. He did nothing of the sort. And he funded it exactly where where de Blasio did, and then is in fact cutting as part of his general kind of budget cuts across agencies. So seeing where he lands, both with the council and on some of these promises, I'll definitely be watching for. And again, when you say conflicts of interest, just to be really clear, I mean, and again, my news organization has done a lot of reporting along these lines. Adams has brought numerous people into high-level, high-paid positions in the administration who, you know, are basically their qualifications are they maybe have done some time in government, but they're loyal to Adams. That's basically their credentials, and they you know they are bringing certain things to the table, but things that they are not necessarily bringing is a kind of perspective about, okay, what is it that we are doing as public servants, as opposed to what are we doing for Eric Adams and what are we doing for ourselves. And I just do think that, you know, this is not within government, but people in Adams' orbit who are like, you know, there's a convicted money launderer. You know, he has people who he's often engaging with, where he says, look, you know, I forgive them for the crimes of their past. Everyone makes mistakes, I sure have. But I think looking at the sort of ethics of the administration is going to be a full-time job for us.
And a full-time job for you to keep track of all of this. Yeah. Thank you for sharing this with us. All right, we want to turn to you for questions. Yeah, right back there in the room. There's a microphone coming to you.
Thank you for a very nice discussion. Question to Mr. Lewis. You mentioned that people are leaving the city because, you know, taxes are less. I just spent 4 months in Miami Beach, Florida. I came back here, I took the subway here today. I got off at 51st and Lexington. There was a homeless guy on the stairwell walking out. I had to make sure he wasn't awake and jump on me in the back. You feel palpably safe in Miami Beach. You feel palpably unsafe here. I think that's more important than saving on the tax money. People do not feel safe in this city. And if you've been away for a while, you see the difference. The police there are not afraid to arrest someone. When you call them, and I've seen it, 8 big burly cops show up. Nobody's going to mess with them. In New York, you have 2 little 5-foot female police ladies showing up.
So,
the city does not
do you have a question you'd love to ask?
That's the question. I mean, do you think that has something to do with
Oh, I'm sure it has something to do with it. I tend to
money?
I tend to exult in the fact that they actually have parking for you when you go down to Florida. That's the thing that always strikes me, is that, you know, they actually want my business. They allow me to put this vehicle here and get out and buy stuff, where in New York, it's like they almost penalize you for it. Look, it's a cliche, but, you know, I happen to believe it. Others, I know, disagree. I don't think you can arrest your way out of problems like homelessness. I mean, you just can't. It's been tried. In fact, we're trying it right now, you know. I just, you know, for one thing, I know what's waiting for them on the other end in Rikers Island. And that's not going to solve a problem. That's going to exacerbate it. So, you know, one thing, actually, to tie up some of the things that we have talked about, one thing that was striking to me, there was this issue about the mayor wanting to appoint Fernando Cabrera, an evangelical pastor who also has been a public servant, a city councilman, to run the mental health effort. That includes very much, you know, people that you're going to see who are homeless or dealing with other kind of issues. The striking thing about it, the LGBTQ community reacted because he's said some things in the past that really upset them. I was really struck by what's his qualification to do any of this stuff, you know? And it reminded me of what we saw in the last administration. If you ask Bill de Blasio himself, I think he, in a quiet and honest moment, he would say he wishes he could relaunch the effort. You know, Thrive was not a campaign promise. Thrive was not something that they had planned in their first 100 days.
Thrive was the mental health.
It was their mental health initiative. And they kept bumping up against, you know, sort of severe mental illness and other forms of mental illness that was stymieing a lot of their efforts. And so they tried to put something together. They cobbled it together. They put his wife in charge of it. So it wasn't staffed properly. It didn't come together in an organic way. And I don't think anybody involved in it would say that it was the success that they had hoped it would be. I hope this administration is not going to reproduce that and just sort of kind of do it on the fly, because you don't want to get out of the subway and wonder what's going on with the people around you.
Right, and this is one of the challenges that they are going to have, and that the tools to actually do something, not only can you not arrest, I mean, you can to a certain extent arrest your way out of it, but the law and the court precedents for actually holding people against their will, it's very difficult to do. This is one reason why, again, as Congressman Torres mentioned, there is an attempt, which may not succeed, to expand Kendra's law so that you can have a little more room for involuntary commitment. That may happen, but that, again, is not locally controlled. Right. There's only so much a mayor can do.
Yeah, right there. Microphone coming to you.
Hi, I'm Dave Marcus. Thank you guys for this discussion. I think, Errol, you're right that at the beginning of this administration, there was an awfully lot of goodwill, especially compared to the last one, from conservatives and moderates in the city. As a conservative in the city and somebody who's very much in those circles, that's withering really fast. The Kyrie thing certainly didn't help. The masks on toddlers didn't help. Quite frankly, the foray into Florida's culture wars with with these billboards about the Florida education law, it just seemed kind of bizarre and off-brand for what Adams was trying to convince, moderates in South Brooklyn, places like that, he was really about. If you guys had to walk someone like me or my neighbors down in Bay Ridge off the bridge here as to why what we're sensing and feeling is wrong, and in fact this is a sea change from de Blasio, what would you say to them?
It's such a good question. I mean, I think what is, that the fact that Adams is not leading ideology first offers that sort of horizon of hope, right? And I think that, as when he declined to answer the questions we were trying to get him to be accountable for to voters, he clearly day to day and minute to minute does not want to kind of show his cards or lead in a way that will cause him to be weak or vulnerable, right? He's a very armored individual. And I do think that he is, and we see this in things like his appointees to the Rent Guidelines Board in the past week, where he's appointed centrist members, including a Manhattan Institute fellow, which has been very upsetting to tenants and tenant advocates. I think we see that where he feels like he can politically accomplish it, that he is open to moving in a more conservative direction. Is he galloping in that direction? Absolutely not. But he's not like de Blasio, where you always knew exactly where he was going to stand on the left.
I would only add to that, when it came to both Fernando Cabrera and two other evangelical pastors that he had appointed that drew a lot of condemnation, he let people protest outside of City Hall. He brought them in and he met with them, and he told them to their faces, I'm not getting rid of any of them. So this is somebody who I think is comfortable in his own skin, wants to steer the course exactly as he sees fit. Again, with minimal input from the outside world, including the media and perhaps some political followers, or people who are sympathetic and part of his base. It's one of those permanent frustrations of politics. When somebody has a base that they know is going to carry them through, they start saying and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. I think that's, that's part of the story of Andrew Cuomo. A politician who feels politically strong, and this is, you can find this in textbooks, that's where they start to overstep, or they start to, maybe lose some of their judgment. I think the key is going to be to make sure we're getting information into whatever process he is setting up for making decisions about whether or not to sort of do something like that ad campaign, which I thought was, it seemed a little strange to me too. It gave him and DeSantis exactly what politicians want, a risk-free way to sort of pander a little bit without ever having to actually do anything one way or the other. Nobody here or in Tallahassee is going to change any policies whatsoever.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
So New York has a history of having its stakeholders come together and also reinventing itself as a city to overcome its most severe crisis. Do you see it happening now, especially in this very divided political environment?
I'd say this gathering is one example of it. One of the other ones that I went to was an all-day conference. I was only there for part of it, held by Trinity Church, which brought in its entire leadership group, to sort of talk about specifically how can we help this mayor succeed. I thought it was incredibly helpful. There are people out there literally praying for this to work. So I think as long as the mayor doesn't take that for granted or squander it, I think there's plenty of room for people to cross ideological lines. I think that is the exciting moment that he has brought us to, that you have somebody who's doesn't come sort of prepackaged from any particular political camp.
I am a little bit more skeptical, and maybe it's because I'm the parent of a teenager and I just sort of see the extent to which life has really moved online for so many people. The sense of being a citizen, of being part of the city, of having a sense of responsibility to others around you. We forget really, or we maybe not reflect every day on how much COVID has really realigned society. And I think that there are clusters that exist of people who are very motivated. Some are very ideologically in their corners. I don't think the Manhattan Institute and DSA or any number of other configurations that have emerged. You have a strong left that has arisen. You have elements of the civic right, and they're all kind of operating in their bubbles right now, sometimes getting people elected, often not. And I think that there's a real rebuilding project, and my news organization, is part of that, right? The idea of really rebuilding local news media environment where we are looking at what's happening in all 5 boroughs and every community and sending the message every day, our communities are all connected. What happens in City Hall relates to what's happening in Edgemere, relates to what's happening in Grassmere and in Van Nest and everywhere in between. And I just think it's so easy to take for granted that sort of civic blood flow is working. And COVID, it literally attacked the circulatory system of our city as much as it did of our bodies.
That's true. I want to make sure I don't forget this corner of the room. I believe you have a hand up. Michael, I see you.
Thank you. I'm really interested in COVID rules too. And I was wondering if you guys thought that the mayor had taken enough of a leadership role in encouraging organizations in the city to really be thoughtful and dynamic. And I guess I would, call out some of the arts organizations, like the Metropolitan Opera, certain places that are, of course, the pride of the city and the pride of the country in many ways, but are like going deeper into COVID rules as a way of some maybe asserting their political credentials or something. And do you feel that it's incumbent upon the mayor to do something? And if so, do you feel that he's done enough?
I think that there was polling out today that showed a real split among the public around masking and vaccinations and public accommodations. And I would venture that for the constituencies at the Metropolitan Opera or MoMA or any of those organizations that are requiring, masks and or vaccinations on an ongoing basis, that, they are doing what they think is what their audiences are demanding. And do I think the mayor has a role in that? Maybe if it's happening a year from now and it's really gone off the edge. I think for now, people are traumatized, people need a comfort level, and I think you have to meet people where they are.
I thought the Kyrie carve-out was not a great idea, not a great move. Having said that, I was there at the Charlotte Hornets game when he returned to the Barclays Center and put us up by a point in the closing 3 minutes, although we lost that game. But the striking thing to me about that night was there were about 18,000 people in the arena. It was at capacity. Me, my son, and Mr. Whammy were the only ones wearing masks. It seems to me, it was. And if you look at the numbers, I just interviewed a doctor last night. The numbers are spiking, and we'll hope that it's not serious. But the 28-day daily positive test average was 1,000, and then for the last 7 days it's 1,400. So we're in the middle of something, and then 14 days later, as we now know, you'll see the accompanying increase in hospitalizations, serious illness, and death. It's nobody asked for it, nobody wants it. There's no reason to blame anybody for it, but we have to take it seriously. And we don't know the long-term effects of having this thing attack your brain and your lungs and your GI tract over and over and over again with different variations. So, there are always going to be a lot of people like me who are going to say maximum caution within reason. And when I see things like the mayor kind of doing stuff, what looked like doing stuff for donors around this question, it made me think, and what I'm trying to tell our audience is that you're going to have to figure this out for yourself, because the politicians are being driven by a lot of different considerations that have nothing to do with you and your family.
All right, final questions. We're going to make it a two for Jordan. We've got two questions right next door to each other. If you don't mind, we'll just lump them together before we hand it over to Nicole. I see you back there on the next panel.
My name is Daniela Souza Gorov, and I want to ask about education because we haven't mentioned that. And I think that that's a huge issue as well. New York City lost so many students, will continue to lose. I am at the CEC District 2, and we lost 5%, 10% of our students. And the literacy crisis, you mentioned the mask on toddlers. Referral for children therapists with speech delays are through the roof. And now New York City is already spending more than $40,000 per student. So how is he going to solve our education crisis that is about to hit when we have state tests to show the literacy crisis that have been created?
Education crisis, yep.
Two for
Well, yeah, we'll just
Take the second question and then.
Different questions, so why don't you wave at her question for a minute?
I would just say David Banks, the new chancellor, was concerned about that very issue months before they ever came into office. He saw it coming. He knew it was coming. He knows it is sort of existential for the system. One of the things that they're doing that I think might show some promise is they're trying to really build out and develop a remote learning option that's going to go beyond the immediate needs of the pandemic and be a way to sort of keep people attached to the system. But their number one concern is dealing with what they say over and over again is the 61%, I think, of students who never make it to grade level. That's their sacred mission. That's what they promise their base. That's what every other meeting at Tweed is going to be about, trying to make sure that that happens. Everything else is sort of secondary to it.
I think Alyssa asked, the most important question, which is, what is the reason, what is the rationale for New York City? What is the role for New York City? And obviously it was a port, it was a great manufacturing center at one time and evolved into other things. If great cities are fundamentally great meeting places of people, then I think we're going to have to think about those businesses, industries, activities where physical proximity of people really is critical and a decisive factor. I think the most absurd example is you can't eat a Michelin star meal on Zoom, right? There's just certain activities that require physical presence, physical proximity. And if New York City were a corporation and I were strategically consulting for them, I would say that you really have to start to think about those activities that really require a city, require people to be together and interacting, because otherwise all of these immigrant service workers will have nobody to serve, and it all collapses at that point. So that's more a statement than a question, but I think that is really ultimately, I think Alyssa asked the most seminal question of all.
I actually do want to connect it back to the question about education, because I think there are two potential paths, and very much with education running through them. There is the transient tourist strand, right? What you're talking about, where people come here, and we're seeing this right now, right? People come, they'll get an Airbnb, even though they're supposedly largely illegal, and they will enjoy what New York has to offer, and they'll go back to wherever they are. And this is not just a New York issue. This is internationally, major cities have faced this before COVID. They're facing it now. Or New York City can be a place where people want to build lives and can build lives, and where the school system is sufficient to have families really put their faith in it. And as I mentioned, I'm a school parent. I'm a public school parent. And my kid is in high school already, so we're pretty much toward the end of the line. But if I were heading in now, I would have a lot of questions about what kind of education they're going to get, how they're rebuilding after COVID, after these shutdowns that have been so devastating in ways where you're absolutely right, we don't know. We sort of starting to know what the impact is, and a lot of it's frankly been, if not explicitly covered up, then has been well hidden. And this is going to be a generational toll the city will have to deal with. So I think the education system is crucial, and I do hope for a future where we're investing in a city where people will want to put down roots and not just kind of pass through for a good meal.
What a great point to end us on. Alyssa, Errol, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. Give them a round of applause.
Thank you.
And I'll ask our next panel to come up. We're welcomed now by my colleague Nicole Gelinas. Nicole is a fellow with us. She's also a frequent writer. She's in City Journal. She's in the New York Post. You read her everywhere. And I also count her as a delightful colleague. And she'll be having a conversation on transportation issues. I know that this is absolutely vital for the future of the city. And we're also welcoming up Sam Schwartz, who will be leading the conversation as an expert gridlock Sam himself. Thank you so much for being a part of this conversation.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks for doing this on short notice.
Should I stay 3 apart or come a little closer?
Oh, I enjoyed that. Also, not the worst to have a panel that ends with somebody saying, Alyssa.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming. As Errol, Alyssa, and Michael discussed, the city has many, many challenges, the likes of which we have not seen before, even in the 1970s and 1980s. And our transportation system is one of the areas that has the biggest challenges. The transportation system both reflects the rest of the city's challenges in recovering from COVID and also creates some of those challenges in recovering from COVID. So if we were sitting here 2.5 years ago, Manhattan every day would have more than 3 million people enter core Manhattan, coming to work, to play, to visit, to go to the doctor, people coming in from New Jersey, Connecticut, Westchester, Long Island. Out of 3 million people plus coming into Manhattan every day, 3 out of 4 of them took some form of mass transportation, mostly the subway, also commuter rail and buses on New Jersey Transit. So today, subway ridership is a little bit less than 60% of what it was before COVID. Commuter rail is even lower than the pre-COVID normal. The short story is that until and unless we figure out a way to get people back on mass transit, it is very, very hard to get Manhattan anywhere near to what it was before COVID. And we've got other challenges too. If that were not enough, we have other problems in addition to the big one. So here to discuss these issues with us and to hopefully give us some answers is Sam Schwartz. Sam, thank you for coming in to talk to us. I think everyone knows Sam. If you read the papers, you know Gridlock Sam. And even if you don't care about traffic, if you don't drive a car, you don't ride in a car, you should read the Gridlock Sam column just to know what's going on, what holidays are coming up, what parades are coming up, what festivals are coming up. This is a good way to plan out your week. Sam grew up in Brooklyn, rode his bike as a kid around Brooklyn. He drove a cab in the late 60s, early 1970s, and started working for city government in the 1971, became traffic commissioner during the mayoralty of Ed Koch. So nobody knows more about New York City transportation than Sam. So Sam, I'll start right in on a kind of grim but important note. This year, for the first quarter, as Transportation Alternatives said yesterday, traffic deaths have skyrocketed. Just as we have a murder problem in the city, we have an issue with traffic deaths also rising by double digits. Over the first quarter, traffic deaths were at 60 people lost their lives. That's 40% more than the first quarter of last year. And over the past 2 years, we've lost a decade of progress in bringing traffic deaths down. Why do you think traffic deaths have gone up so much during the past 2 years, and what should we do about it?
By the way, Nicole, thanks for the introduction and for inviting me here at the last minute. I think somebody else was supposed to be.
Yeah.
the
We
commissioner.
won't talk about
We won't
someone
talk
else.
about that?
We won't
Okay.
dwell on that. We're happy with who we have.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Yeah, the numbers are grim. The numbers are worse than we've seen in a long time. And the kinds of crashes are more horrific than we've seen in a long time. If any of you are drivers, and sometimes I drive, I'm no longer driving like when I drove a cab crazy through the streets of New York, but you're seeing people behaving outrageously on the road. There was a crash about 3 weeks ago on the Henry Hudson Parkway, and the Henry Hudson Parkway has a 30-inch divider. And a car landed on the Amtrak tracks. 3 people were killed. And I went out to the location just to see how did that happen, because those barriers are meant to keep the car in its lane. There were no marks on the barrier. That meant that that vehicle was airborne, never touched the barrier because there was a curve in the road there and the road had crested. So that vehicle just went airborne. To get airborne that height, you have to be doing 100, 120, maybe 130 miles an hour. We're seeing behavior we haven't seen before. Why that behavior? It's somehow, maybe it is related to, the violence, violence we're seeing, the criminal violence, but the traffic violence. I'm not a psychologist. My theory is there's a degree of fatalism that we're experiencing. So many people have died. Why follow the rules? I know I almost felt that after 9/11. I had lived across from the World Trade Center in Battery Park City, and then I was working there, and I was homeless at the time. So yeah, I had that attitude, if the world ends tomorrow. I don't know if that's it, so I don't have a good explanation why. But one thing that you should know is New York is sadly not alone. It is happening throughout the United States. But prior to COVID, prior to the epidemic, there were pretty bad signs before that. So we took a quantum leap in the last 2 years, but prior to that, there was an increase in traffic violence, particularly at pedestrians. Pedestrian deaths from 2009 to 2019 or 2020, which was pre-COVID or just early COVID, went up by 64%. People were getting killed on our roads, on our streets. Traffic deaths that had been declining steadily from the 80s and 90s and suddenly started to level off, not go down any longer. So something was there before COVID. Something is happening now nationally. I haven't checked all the numbers internationally, but nationally and in a few discussions with colleagues in Europe, they're not seeing it like we're seeing it. Something is going on. I don't know exactly what, but I know what, we're also not enforcing rules.
Yeah, and since you brought it up and saying that people are behaving outrageously, I wasn't going to put you on the crime spot because I know you're not a criminologist, but it's interesting to note that in the city, the peak year of traffic deaths in 1990, with 701 people killed in a traffic crash, coincided with the peak year of murders, 2,200 and odd people killed in homicides. And the lowest year for both was also the same, 2018, 2019, when we got traffic deaths and murders much, much closer to the 300 level. So it is interesting. I mean, there's some relationship there between the people committing violent crime with guns and knives and the people driving very recklessly. So what would you do if you were a transportation commissioner? How would you address the crisis of traffic deaths?
Well, let me first say the correlation that you spoke about is a correlation that's been documented. So I think for a variety of reasons it hasn't been implemented widely, but there were studies that were shown that when you focused on traffic violence, areas where you had a lot of people being injured and killed, crime in those areas also went down. So there seemed to be a correlation between that. The acronym I remember for the study was DDACTS, so somebody could look it up. One of the things that I would do is I would change the job to what it once was. So traffic enforcement in the police department is considered, the low job. You don't give the best and the brightest duty on traffic.
Right.
So you can't expect a lot of the police department. They are criminologists. That's their raison d'etre. They will spend their time doing that. Back in 1973, there was an African-American traffic commissioner, the only one, Benjamin Ward. He had come from the police department. He was a deputy police commissioner, and he became my boss. And I was like his right-hand sidekick on it. And he said, let's take a lot of enforcement out of the police department. They don't like doing it. They don't do it particularly well. And let's do it with civilians, and let's do it with people that look like the people that they're enforcing. So we did some experiments. I remember going up on a roof at 57th and 3rd and filming whether a traffic agent or meter maid, whatever the name was at the time, can direct traffic and people would obey that person. And that worked. And Ben Ward was only in for about a year, but that set in motion the granting the traffic agents the authority to write all kinds of parking tickets and moving violations, ultimately moving violations. Towing. So back in 1982, when I became traffic commissioner, thanks to Ben Ward, who was police commissioner at the time and was backing me all the way, I had 2,000 uniformed people reporting to the traffic department. They could write parking tickets, they could tow cars, they could enforce bike rules, they could spill back of intersections, they could write some moving violations, although the majority were written by the police department. So one of the things that I would do is make a pitch to bring back traffic enforcement to the Department of Transportation and use science in the application of where these people should be working and what they should do. The way the police department works, and they do some really good work, but when it comes to traffic, somebody says you got a traffic problem, okay, write more tickets. You still have a traffic problem, write even more tickets. It doesn't matter whether they're good tickets or bad tickets. If it's a ticket for a little broken tail light versus a speeding ticket, it still counts as one ticket, whereas one has a direct impact on public safety. So that would be step one. But
what about cameras? I mean, we've got cameras in school districts, but the state legislature makes the city turn them off after school. And most of the speeding takes place at night, well after 10, 11 o'clock at night. Would you try to do more with cameras?
Yeah, more people are killed at night. More people are killed during hours other than school. Oh, I would do a lot more with cameras. Cameras, speed cameras,
red
light cameras. They have been shown to reduce crashes, but politically, doesn't matter if you're on the right or the left. The politics, it goes across the aisle on that. Somehow it's, freedom of something to not have to follow the traffic rules. They're not taking your picture if you're following the traffic rules. So, I'm all for speed cameras, because I don't think the police will ever be able to fully do it, and of late, and maybe the right decision, they don't do chases. So if somebody's doing 100 miles an hour, they're gone.
Right.
On it. But speed camera would pick up somebody going 100 miles an hour, although what I've been noticing is people are beginning to fool around with their license plates. Right. And I'm calling for a license plate integrity squad that would see that people are really obeying the rules on that, because congestion pricing, I'm sure you're going to get to it, Nicole, is coming, and there'll be every incentive for people to play with their license plates and do amazingly creative things, like the truck driver on the George Washington Bridge who pressed a button and his license plate would flip when he did that. So they're very creative out there.
Yeah, and with the cameras, if someone is behaving egregiously recklessly, they could go seize that car when it's not in motion, so they don't have to engage in a chase. I mean, if you've caught someone going, 120 miles an hour over the Hudson, if they, provided they're not using a fake license plate, track them down and seize the car when they're not in the car.
Yeah, exactly.
So the transit system, with the MTA, which runs the subway and bus system, has tremendous fiscal challenges. Once the federal rescue money runs out sometime in the middle of next year, they are going to be looking at multi-billion-dollar annual deficits. They need a way to get their riders back, not just to address those deficits, but just to get people back into Manhattan at least a few days a week. What would you do to try to get people back onto the subways, buses, and commuter rail in terms of flexible ticketing, different scheduling, anything on that or anything else?
Yeah, I did a survey last April, and we surveyed people who try to project in the future. When COVID is gone, how do you think you'll travel? These were people coming into the central business district. And there was a chunk of them that was subway riders that said they wouldn't take the subway anymore. Of that chunk, we found 87% were afraid of contracting the virus on the subway. They're afraid of a disease. When in fact, there have been a number of studies, including one from my company, but other public health companies. London tests the air regularly and looking for virus, touches the surfaces, looking for fomites. The MTA should assure people, and I'm not saying they should make it up, go out there, have independent testers of the air at Times Square, at the busiest stations, and even at the neighborhood stations, and see what's in the air, and see if scientists find, as they have not yet found in London, they went to the busiest subways. So the first thing is to assure that that portion is safe. The second, no surprise, that was just behind disease was crime.
Yep.
And this was a year ago, and it seems like the crime situation is worse than it was a year ago. We've got to get a handle on crime. One thing that puzzles me, and I've suggested it, when you ride the subway, one of the worst feelings is you don't know if the person behind you is going to shove you into the tracks. And so the MTA has, for, 15, 20 years, said, we'll do a study on these doors that cost billions of dollars to do. Well, I looked at what Seoul did before they did that. I looked at what Shanghai did. And they just simply had a little fence. So you stand behind the fence, and then there's the opening for the doors, and then you stand behind the other fence, and there's the opening of the doors. Instead of billions of dollars, I looked it up, you can buy one for about $150. Okay, there's an installation cost on it. But if anybody remembers the old Times Square shuttle stop had those bars. They had it for years. I take pictures because they have bars at the end of the stations of people that I have a great picture of a person who's reading a book with his foot up. Now, he wouldn't be doing that in the middle of the platform on it. So there are things that they can do. The station I just came out of, I decided to walk from Broadway, was filthy, was absolutely filthy there. So Rich Davey, who hasn't started yet, I think is pretty good. I hope he'll be an Andy Byford. I hope he doesn't get fired because he does too good a job and upstages the governor. But I think he knows what is needed. And I'm hoping that they look for some of these low-cost solutions like the L train. We were going to lose the L train for a year and a half, and we didn't have to lose it. And it's almost like this industrial complex of the consulting industry, which I'm part of, who makes their money when problems become more complicated, not when they become simpler. There's no moving parts in what I'm suggesting, and therefore you don't even need an engineer to put up a little fence and a couple of posts. However, if you're going to deal with these other gates, which you should at some time 10, 15 years in the future, if you've got a few extra $1 billion on it, Then you've got to deal with airflow and emergency access, and well, what if the doors don't close? There's a lot of complications, a lot of engineering. So some engineering companies are going to do really well. Not me. I sold my engineering company, but I still do a little consulting. So it won't be me making the money, but somebody will make a lot of money. And there will be a huge document and explaining how and where. So simple. Keep it simple and we can get so much.
Yeah, that's, they don't have a history of being very flexible and dynamic, which now is the time they need to be flexible and dynamic. Like, for example, Richard Davey was saying in one of the papers this morning, he wants to change around the schedules and maybe have fewer rush hour trains on the weekdays, more trains on the weekends. It would at least be a move toward being flexible. If it works, it works. If it doesn't work, stop doing it. I mean, do you think that's a good thing to start thinking about, or you think we should not be cutting any service whatsoever?
Yeah, I'm not crazy about cutting service because you lose the people. And, I lived through from the late 40s, the 50s, when the system suffered because we held the fare for 44 years, from 1904 to 1948, a nickel fare, and then we went to a dime, and then by the time I was riding, it was 15 cents on it. But what would happen is, as the Transit Authority could not afford to provide all the service, there were fewer riders, they cut back the service. They cut back the service, that led to fewer riders, and it became this vicious downward cycle. And that lasted until the 90s, until we started creeping back up. That was a 30-year recovery from that. So I'm not crazy about cutting service. Let's figure out more efficient ways. I do recognize that the weekends maybe they are busier. And so let's try to match some of that service. And also, I'm not one for keeping the fare forever at $2.75. I think there are ideas of having some bargains on the fares. If you do 12 rides, that's great. But I think we should look at people who could afford it, should pay more. Low-income people, keep the fares for low-income people at whatever it is today, $1.30 per ride, something like that.
Yeah, that's an interesting issue because we have something that we haven't seen in 40 years, which is inflation. So the longer that they don't raise the fare, the more we risk that we have a 30% fare hike all at once, and then people say, I can't afford a 30% fare hike, similar to what we saw back in the 1950s, where when they doubled the fare, a lot of people left the bus system. I mean, if we go right from $2.75 to $4, that's a big shock. It would be better to do it gradually rather than wait another 3 years. So we've got a few minutes before we go to Q&A. So before we get to congestion pricing, which I know everyone is in complete agreement on, so there won't be any controversy, I'll ask you another question where there's complete agreement on, which is bicycles. City Bike is the only form of organized transportation to recover its pre-COVID ridership, doing more than 100,000 rides a day, some fall days. Bicycling over the 4 bridges and over 2 key bike lanes was up by a third in 2020. People didn't want to take the train, they were on their bicycles. Can we get more people on bicycles, and what would we need to do that?
Well, one thing we have to always look at is what mode of transportation were they taking before, and just be prepared for it. So I'm not so worried about those numbers being so big, because even if we say 100,000, whatever the numbers are, they're still well below 2% coming into the central business district, even now. So it's not a big number. It's not going to have a dramatic effect on transit. And should we have good bike lanes? Yeah, but we should also have enforcement. Enforcement of illegally parked cars, placard parking. Don't get me started on that. I mean, it's outrageous. It's gotten worse than it's ever before. I went to City Hall for the first time in a while. I couldn't believe City Hall Park was just overrun with parked cars. That's some signal that the mayor is sending out.
Under the new mayor.
Under the new
so
mayor.
you think there's been a change?
I think it got worse under de Blasio. He for some reason gave away placards to teachers when in fact that was not city policy. The lanes were supposed to be clear to get emergency vehicles to save kids during emergencies or for parents to drop off. Instead, he gave, I think it was 190,000 teacher parking. So yeah, it got worse under de Blasio. It was terrible under de Blasio, and I don't see any improvement right now. And that almost would have an immediate effect. It would be good for truckers. If you walk around the City Hall area, you'll see all the no standing except truck zones filled with cars with placards, and the placards are ridiculous placards. It's like friend of a friend who knows somebody. There's so many phony placards that are out there. So I got myself started on that, and I couldn't turn off.
Yeah. And you've always said, if someone's parked in a truck zone, they should be towed, but the placards, if they're parked in a legal spot, they should be taxed. If you're a city worker, you're getting a benefit that's worth $4,000 or $5,000 a year, that this should be tracked down and a note should be sent to the federal government that you've made $4,000 in non-tangible income. So I'll move on to congestion pricing. Some applause. The congestion pricing is the law. 3 years ago this budget season, Governor Cuomo got the state legislature to pass the law saying that the MTA can go through the process and implement a congestion pricing charge, effectively to charge a fee to come into Manhattan below 60th Street. Obviously, they haven't done it yet, and it's not clear when the MTA will actually put this in motion. Do you think they will do it? Do you think they should do it? And what are some things people could expect from congestion pricing?
Well, they should do it. I'll answer that one. But how we got into a position like this is, lack of leadership, lack of courage. Back when congestion pricing was passed, April 1st, 2019, I think it was, the next month, the MTA came out with a request for proposals to do an environmental statement. And in that request for proposal, it was supposed to be done in 5 months by November. There were 2 finalists. We were a finalist, my company, and another team. The other team won, okay. So in 5 months, they should have been finished. That would have been in 2019. At the end of 2020, there was supposed to, deliberately after the 2020 election, there was supposed to be a panel of 6 people who would then define the program. There is no program. I can tell you the skeleton of it, but there is no program. And that hasn't happened. Nobody's been appointed. I don't see this governor doing anything. If you follow the MTA schedule, we're not going to know anything coincidentally until after the election. Pure coincidence that's when maybe we'll know what it is on it. So I would say 23 is likely, but then we go 24 is an election year. And all the people that are asking for exemptions, it baffles me because we have 15 toll facilities in New York City right now. We have the Tri-Borough Bridge and Tunnel Authority has 9 bridges and tunnels. The Port Authority has 6. That's 15 just touching the 5 boroughs. We don't give exemptions. If you're low income, we don't give you exemptions. If you go to a doctor, we don't give you exemptions. If you're a firefighter going to work, we don't give you an exemption. City workers, we don't give exemptions. Everybody's lining up for an exemption. The only exemption I think there should be is for veterans of Woodstock. That's it, only but if you could prove you were there, you weren't there. So, as they say.
All right, well, on that note, let's go to some questions. I see you were the first one to raise your hand, so you can, and you have the microphone there.
Thanks. Just to point out, one of the reasons why I believe that traffic fatalities have grown is because the de Blasio administration in March of 2020 stopped enforcement of the scofflaw program. So there's no booting, no towing of people who had no insurance or who would run up crazy tickets or who had red light violations. There's no enforcement, and that program still hasn't restarted. The Adams administration is committed to it, but we'll see it's taking time. And so you let people who ignore the law out on the streets, those are the people who are going to commit more serious crimes. But besides from that, if you had 3 things to recommend, Sam, to the new administration in their 100 days, other than placard enforcement, what would the 3 traffic management recommendations be?
I would, as I said, turn over traffic enforcement to the Department of Transportation, hire a tough-as-nails traffic commissioner who would carry it out. It's easier done, because I know I did it. And then continue the program of redesigning streets to reduce casualties. The BQE, traffic jams have been caused by the new design, but casualties while around the city have soared. They went down on the BQE by 60%, crashes went down by 30%, injury crashes went down. So design, and then the third thing, automated enforcement.
Yes.
Hi. Nicole, I know that you've written a lot about fare evasion. My question is, has the mayor done anything about it? Has there been any change in policy?
The short story is maybe. The mayor has said, to his credit, multiple times since taking office, he wants everyone following the rules in the subway system, that you pay your fare, you get from point A to point B, and you exit the system. But in terms of the numbers, we don't see any stepped up enforcement. If you look at civil summons for jumping over the turnstile, which the vast majority of people who jump over the turnstile, they used to get a civil summons. You pay a $100 fine. So you look at those, and you also look at arrests. If you get arrested for jumping over the turnstile, if you've done this multiple times before, or if you have other warrants or you have a weapon with you, both of those are down by 30% the first 2 months of 2022 compared to the first 2 months of 2019. And they were down then. I mean, we had backed away on enforcement because Cy Vance said he wouldn't prosecute fare beating, and there was a stepping back of that kind of proactive policing. So far, no, we don't see the enforcement in the numbers. And in order to see these crime numbers go down, you won't see that until those numbers start to go back up. I don't know if you want to add anything, or if you want to wisely stay away from the controversial issue of fare evasion.
Yeah, I'm for enforcement.
Yeah. Let's go to the back of the gentleman. Yes.
Just wanted to know a little bit about what is the legal status of scooters, motorized skateboards that we're constantly seeing out in the streets, and what can we do to ensure that the safety of people walking in the streets, because it seems like they're becoming a real danger, and we don't really feel safe out in the streets with them out there. So just your opinion, and what is legal status, and what are some of the things that the Adams administration is doing to deal with that?
And before Sam answers, I just want to point out an 87-year-old woman was killed by someone on a motorized scooter this week.
Yeah, I saw that. The status is, I have not seen anything from the city or the state, and the state's involved because it registers vehicles. Most of the scooters that you see are technically illegal in New York City and illegal in New York State. They cannot be registered. What probably needs to happen is some process to say, we have these vehicles, and here are what the rules are going to be with these vehicles, and they're going to have license plates, and they're going to have to be prominently marked in some way so there can be some identification, and helmets need to be worn, and they have to follow all the rules and regulations. Right now, it's the Wild West out there. The scooters will ride in bike lanes, motorcycles. I was riding on the Hudson River bike path, and 2 motorcycles on the bike path scared the hell out of me, and I was near that section where you move just a couple of feet and you're in the Hudson River. There's no barrier. So I don't see any leadership on that whatsoever. And, you know, people are angry. On the other hand, they often single out the workers, the delivery people, and that's on us. We all think we have room service in New York City. We call, and within 20 minutes, 30 minutes, somebody gets there. So we've reinforced a system like that. So I have a little bit, more heart for people that are doing it for work than people that are just defying all the rules and regulations. Look at Revel had 3 people died and then said, okay, you'll have to take a picture with the helmet. I'd say fewer than half have helmets on that are riding Revel scooters. We have to hold people accountable and hold businesses accountable. On every Revel scooter, not just Revel, there should be big numbers that you could read. So you see that guy going through a red light, you report it, a reporting mechanism on that. And use cameras also to see if they have compliance. This is not about liberties. This is about our safety. People are using our public thoroughfare that primarily, initially was for walking, and they're taking away the rights of walkers and the safety of walkers. And pedestrian deaths, as you heard, are awful.
Yeah. And I know Lou had his hand up in the back there. Just wait for the microphone as well.
Thank you both for a great discussion. Sam, your earlier advocacy for tolling reform pointed to the need to also be making investments in the city's highway and bridge network. And I wonder both of your views on this. If as policymakers continue to reallocate more of the street network to bus lanes and bike lanes and to more aggressively manage truck traffic on the street network, how important is it for there to be corollary investments in the highway and bridge network to improve its performance?
Yeah, it's all key. And if you remember the Move New York plan, and Lou, I'd come and presented it to you, it set aside some for road and bridge maintenance. The final plan ended up with no money for roads and bridges. So it's got to come from somewhere else, or we will see a repeat of the 1980s. You know, when I was chief engineer in the 1980s of the Department of Transportation, the 1980s, a lot of people here weren't even around then, but in that one decade between New York and Connecticut, the metro area, 15 people died in bridge collapses. We forget that. Part of the FDR Drive collapse, killing a Brooklyn dentist below. Cables snapped on the Brooklyn Bridge, killing a Japanese tourist. 10 people died in the Schoharie, part of the New York State Thruway collapsed. The Mianus River Bridge collapsed. If we don't invest, we will pay in another way. And we'll pay in a way, the first is take trucks off expressways. That's what's going to happen with the BQE unless somebody grabs hold of it and says, we're going to finally fix it, instead of waiting for it to get so weak that the engineers conclude the trucks can't use it. That's the first victim of it if it doesn't have a failure on it. But yeah, Lou, that's a real problem. We can't, I'm so for transit, but you have to have your roads and bridges, and especially if you're going to build a big network for buses, which are heavier vehicles, and a big network for bicycles, and big network for pedestrians.
Yeah, and that's interesting that Lou brought it up, because if you look at the City Council's response to the Adams budget, the council adds money for housing, the council adds money for bike lanes, bus lanes, many important projects, more mental health services, but nothing for bridges or core street infrastructure. It's nobody's favorite topic until something falls down. I think we have time for a couple more questions. Yes. And
hi, thank you. What's your view on outdoor dining impact on traffic and people circulation, as well as public space utilization by the community?
There it's almost personal. I love dining outdoors, and I've been enjoying it. But you know, here we have the competition of the same space. The restaurants want that curb space. The bike riders want a lane for curbs. The delivery people want it. I would say we have to figure out a way with all the technology that we have that in the morning the trucks come in, right after that sanitation cleans it, then you know you could put down the restaurants there and they can disappear, you know, by some magic. I think there are ways that we should look at technology to control those lanes and roll things out. We see overnight, the 9th Avenue Food Festival, all of a sudden there's booths everywhere. And the following morning, you know, the booths are gone. So we have done this. Let's figure out a way to do it, but it can't be on the backs of the trucks, and it can't be on the backs of others, and buses as well.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of imply this, but I think it should be outside. We shouldn't be building buildings in the middle of the sidewalk. If you go to Paris or Berlin or Lyon, outdoor dining is tables and chairs outside. You know, they don't build another restaurant. It is a warm weather and a sunny weather endeavor. Any more? Yes.
Yes, I had a couple of comments. First of all, when you talk about the subways and the reason why people aren't riding them, you know, one of the big issues is homelessness, sanitary, people sleeping. And until this crime and the homeless and cleanliness are resolved, you know, usage is going to be down. Second of all, congestion pricing and bike lanes may attract some people, but they're going to drive away other people. In my own family, my brother used to commute into the city. He now has moved his business outside of the city because it just became too difficult for him to come in except once in a while. And the third issue is construction cost. You know, they want to spend, you know, $10 zillion on 3 stations on the 2nd Avenue subway, of which one is already a subway station for a different line, for billions of dollars, and we just don't do enough. We don't get enough bang for the buck. And, you know, can you talk to the construction cost and the other problems that we have? And one last thing is the bicycles. There's no enforcement of traffic laws requiring people not to sound and not to blow lights. I nearly got run down just walking over here this morning. And it happens almost every day where the bicycle scoff laws are endangering pedestrians and keeping people out of the city.
Well, let me focus on there were a lot you covered. Let me focus on the congestion pricing driving people out. That has not been the experience in London. Central London got better, more exciting, great pedestrian places, and more people came in to London. Same thing happened in Stockholm and Milan and Singapore and a number of other places. So the experience of congestion pricing is 85% of the people don't change the way they behaved. About 15% do. They may go at other times if you have graduated prices, or they may double up in their cars, or they may go into public transportation. But New York acts like, oh my God, congestion pricing. That every entry point is going to be tolled. Does that sound a little familiar? Anybody here from Staten Island? Tom? Okay. Does that sound familiar? That every single, you know, we've had it in Staten Island forever. We have had it forever from New Jersey, and New Jersey continued to grow, and people in New Jersey kept working in New York City. So we've had it. And the East River bridges were all built with tolls when Mayor William Gaynor, a little bit before my time, you know, removed the tolls from the East River bridges in 1911. But it's a restoration. It's a return to that.
All right, one last question, and then I'll give Sam the last word. Yes.
Hello. Good afternoon to everybody. My name is Rosie, and I was just invited by my daughter. But first place, this hotel is really, to me, excellent. But anyway, you know, mostly the pedestrian, the paint has been it's not anymore visible. The pedestrian paints, and then we need more traffic lights, to be mostly also in Soho, little streets like that. So I think we still need more meetings and improvement for everybody to voice.
So better marked crosswalks,
Thank
more
you very
traffic lights.
Yeah, and shorten the crosswalks by building out the curbs. That gives less exposure to the pedestrian, and if there's already parking on that block, that means you're not losing any parking. So sometimes you can have your cake and eat it too.
Any parting thoughts for the future of the next, I forget the number, 1,361 days or something of the Adams administration?
Yeah, I'd love for him to come out with congestion pricing, come out big and say no exemptions. And then I'd like him to set the stage for that by saying, I am taking away 200,000 placards, and we're going to have an independent entity that will enforce the rules against government workers. Government workers have to follow, and I was a government worker for 20 years, have to follow the rules and regulations. 40 some odd years ago, I went to see traffic enforcement in Scotland Yard, and we got in the car, and the Scotland Yard officer put on his seatbelt. And I put on my seatbelt. I said to him, when I would ride in a police car, the cops never wear seatbelts. Now, this is 1978. And he looks at me curiously and says, but aren't they supposed to set examples? And so what we need is a mayor that's going to set examples in so many different ways, riding public transportation, getting rid of his own placard, and coming down to us, the people, and making walking number one and safe out there once again, and rebuilding trust in our transit system.
Well, thank you, Sam, and thank you, everyone, for your enlightened questions.
I'm Hannah Meyers. I am the Director of Policing and Public Safety for the Manhattan Institute. Everyone has been talking about crime today, but Jim Quinn and I are going to actually solve it for you and really explain it. We're very lucky to have Jim Quinn today. He served as a New York City prosecutor in the Queens DA's office for 42 years, rising to Deputy Bureau Chief for Homicide Investigations, Bureau Chief for Narcotics Investigations, ultimately Executive Assistant District Attorney supervising around 155 ADAs in intake, criminal court, grand jury, career criminal, gang violence, hate crime, Supreme Court, narcotic trial bureaus. And in this capacity, he tried Kwame Jackson for the 1993 murder of police officer Milagros Johnson and tried the first death penalty case in Queens County, wherein James Allen Gordon was convicted of murder in the first degree and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Jim also served as an adjunct professor at St. John's University School of Law. Since his retirement in 2020, Jim has quickly become a voice of clarity on prosecution policy and public safety, publishing frequently in places including New York Post and City Journal. Lately, he has taken on the behind-the-scenes role of explaining at great length to prominent mainstream journalists exactly how prosecution policy and laws work, so that they can better understand it themselves. And he is also working on a very data-centered report for Manhattan Institute's Policing and Public Safety Initiative on the impact of bail reform on public safety and how well we can measure the harm that it's done. Or not done. We'll see when he publishes.
It's done.
The harm that it has done. So first question to you, Jim. Mayor Eric Adams ran, as we've discussed, very explicitly on a crime-fighting platform and has been consistent since taking office in how important that is to him and to step up in enforcement. But here we are, a quarter of the way through 2022, and as others have mentioned, with the exception of a slight decrease in the murder rate, crime is up significantly. Shooting victims have almost doubled since this time in 2019, and even just since last year, they're up 15%. That's about 158 more people shot already this year than had been in 2019. And just since last year, also, grand larceny autos are up over 80%. Grand larcenies are up by 50%. Robberies up a third. Burglaries nearly doubled. What is going on? And could Adams be doing something different that would be taking us in, either holding us steady or taking us in a better direction?
Well, first, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. I think to understand what's happening in New York City today, you have to go back in history a little bit to decide or to understand why the bail laws were passed, why they were changed the way that they were. Go back all the way to 2015, New York City passed a law to allow the city to post bail for defendants charged with minor crimes. It was a big goal of the de Blasio administration to reduce the size of the population on Rikers Island. Just generally, they just wanted to reduce it and get it down. When he took office, the population was about 10,000 or 11,000 on Rikers Island. Allowing the city to post bail for defendants was designed to get defendants charged with non-violent crimes out of Rikers Island. The city would actually post the bail, which was ridiculous. I mean, you would have a defendant arrested by the police, the prosecutor asked for bail, a city judge set bail, and then the city funded a nonprofit to go and post the bail for the defendant out of city funds. It was ridiculous. Yeah, I mean, it just, and it just set the tone for everything that followed. In 2016, the movement to close Rikers really started to take hold. Mm-hmm. And Melissa Mark Viverito, who was the Speaker of the City Council, appointed a commission to study Rikers Island and how to close it. And she appointed Jonathan Lippman, who was a former Chief Judge of the Court of Appeals, to oversee the commission. And the commission consisted of 40 to 50 people, a lot of good government groups, some real estate corporations, businesses, some defense providers, a couple of DAs, and they, studied Rikers Island. Their mandate from Viverito was to study not whether to close Rikers Island, but how to close Rikers Island. That was specifically their mandate. So they came out with a report in 2017. And in 2017, the population on Rikers was still about 9,800 defendants. The commission came out with a proposal to reduce the size of the city jail population down to 6,000. And they recommended that the city build 4 jails all around the city of New York, one in each of the 4, actually they recommended 5, one in each county. They recommended one in Staten Island. The city later on changed that to just 4, took Staten Island jail out. But they proposed that the city reduce the jail population down to 6,000 from about 10,000. And Judge Lippman and the commission recommended that they do this by, one way they do it, by changing the bail laws to get the nonviolent defendants out of Rikers Island and misdemeanor defendants out of Rikers Island. Now, I've been involved in this since 2015. I testified before the City Council against the city posting bail. That was in 2015. I did it on behalf of DA Richard Brown, who was a wonderful public servant, a great district attorney, and was very much opposed to the closing of Rikers Island under the circumstances that they were trying to do it. So when Judge Lippman made this proposal, I used to go to meetings with the mayor's office, and their plans to close Rikers Island would reduce the population down to 6,000, 5,500 around in that area, by getting all the turnstile jumpers out of jail, the marijuana smokers out of jail, the prostitutes out of jail, and they felt that they could safely reduce the population down from, again, about 10,000 and 9,700 down to about 6,000. So I looked at that, and I went back to my office. This is a long answer, but it'll set the tone for everything. So I go back to my office, and I asked our data people to run a report for me. And I wanted to know how many people were in jail on Rikers Island simply because they jumped a turnstile. So they ran a report, and there were none. So then I said, well, what about people who are there just because they were smoking marijuana or with small amounts of marijuana? And there were none. And then I asked them, well, how many prostitutes are on Rikers Island? And there were none. And, you know, in Queens, even back in 2017, 2018, we had a human trafficking court where all the prostitution cases went, and all the prostitutes were given treatment. They were sent to social service agencies, and we tried to get them out of the profession that they were in. We had very highly trained people talk to them. So, I mean, I knew there were no prostitutes in Rikers. I knew that there were no turnstile jumpers in Rikers. There were very few people on Rikers Island out of the 10,000 that they had who were charged solely with misdemeanors and were there solely because they were charged with a misdemeanor. So another way that Judge Lippman wanted to reduce the population was to speed up the processing of cases. He was chief judge of the Court of Appeals for 12 or 15 years before he became chairman of this commission. He was in charge of speeding up the processing of cases. If it was so easy to do, he would have done it in the 15 years that he had. It's not easy to speed up the processing of cases. They estimated that they'd reduce the population by, I think, 700 by just, you know, moving cases faster. Well, you know, the reality is that defense attorneys don't want to move cases fast. They want to slow everything down. So anything that speeds up the caseload, you know, the processing of the felony cases, they're not interested in. Right. So that wasn't going to work. So the recommendation in the Lippman Commission was that the state pass bail reform to change the way that judges set bail and change the criteria that they use to set bail. Mm-hmm. And that was a major part of the impetus to get the bail laws changed, was to reduce the population on Rikers to 6,000 so that they could close Rikers and build the new jails all around the city.
I feel like the wrong end of the stick to be.
Yes. So what happened then, once the city came out with a proposal to build 4 jails around the city, each jail was supposed to have 1,500 beds. They had to build 6,000 cells in order to house 5,500 prisoners, because they have to have some leeway when prisoners change and people come in, people come out. It's almost like a hotel, but not a hotel. And so they had to have extra beds for certain overflow. So the city then issued this plan for these 4 jails around the city, one in the Bronx, Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens, with 1,500 beds. And they they released it. The jail in Queens was supposed to be 30 stories tall. The one in Brooklyn was supposed to be 40. I think the one in Manhattan was supposed to be 40. And the Bronx, I think, was also about 30. Now, these were being built right near the courthouses in each county. The community opposition was so vehemently opposed. I mean, like crazy, crazy proposed. The councilmen in the districts didn't want to do it. The city council was getting antsy about doing it. So what the city then did, they then said, all right, you don't want 6,000 cells? We'll reduce it to 3,300 cells. No studies about what this is going to do to crime in New York City, no studies about the people who are going to be released from Rikers, nothing. We'll reduce it to 3,300 so that you won't complain as much about these jails in your neighborhoods. So now they get the city councilmen in those districts to approve these smaller jail cells, which now house, I think it's about 890 people each, reduced from the 1,500 that were going to be in the original plan. And now the city issues this plan for 3,300 jail cells on Rikers Island, not on Rikers Island, but in the new jails. And it passes through the city council, and they speed everything up through the the land use, the ULURP process. I'm never sure what that stands for, but it's a zoning process. They sped that up. Their public hearings were ridiculous. People were given like 24 hours notice when a public hearing was going to be held. And it went through the whole system. So now they've got a plan to build 3,300 jail cells to house what at the time, by that time, the population had gone to about 8,700. So in order to fit the 5,700 or the 8,700 prisoners in the 3,300 cells, they have to release 5,000 people from Rikers Island. And they have to do it by the time the new jails are built. So what do? Well, the state legislature comes forward with the new bail laws. And what they do with the new bail laws is it's specifically designed to get people out of Rikers Island. There's just no doubt about it. Absolutely, positively designed to reduce the population on Rikers Island. They passed the law on April 1st of 2019. They passed the new bail laws. They passed it in the middle of the night as part of a budget. A lot of the state legislators didn't realize what they were voting for. They didn't realize what was in the package. We, as prosecutors, didn't know what was in it. They also passed a whole bunch of other discovery reforms, which I hope we'll get to, and a whole bunch of other reforms to the criminal justice system that the DAs around the state had very, very little input into. And whatever we had input into, it was, you got to be kidding me. And I remember getting the call from my chief assistant telling me what these new rules were. So April 1st, they passed the law, the new bail law. It prohibits a judge from setting bail on any misdemeanor, no matter what the defendant's record is, no matter how many cases he has pending, no matter what the crime is, no bail. And when I say no bail, it means the defendant gets released. The judge cannot set bail on E felonies or D felonies. They're not what they call qualifying offenses. The only offenses that a judge can set bail on are murder, attempted murder, burglary in the first degree. The original bill said the judge couldn't even set bail on a home burglary, a residential burglary. A defendant is caught in your house. He's got another pending burglary case, but he's arrested in your house in the middle of the night. You don't know him, he's a stranger. He gets arrested, a judge couldn't set bail on that guy. He had to let him go. That was in the original bill. Robberies, robbery in the second degree, judge couldn't set bail on that. Couldn't set bail on a non-violent felony offense, a car thief. He could have 5 car theft cases pending. He could be a prior predicate felon. A judge could not set bail. He had to release the defendant under very low restrictive conditions. Once that law passed on April 1st of 2019, the day it was passed, there were 7,800 people on Rikers Island, 7,822 to be exact, the day that it passed. The law became effective 8 months later on January 1st of 2020. On January 1st of 2020, the population on Rikers was about 5,544. In other words, 2,300 people had been released from Rikers from April 1st to January 1st in 8 months, 2,800 people.
And was that preemptive?
Yes.
Some of it was preemptive because what the judges did, they didn't want the specter of 2,800 people walking out of Rikers Island on January 1st all at once, because that's the day the law became effective. And on that date, on January 1st, a defendant could not be held in bail on a misdemeanor, couldn't be held in jail on a nonviolent felony, and could only be held on bail on certain very specific offenses. So on January 1st, all those the bails that all those defendants had were exonerated, and the defendants were released by January 1st. But the judges started releasing them in October and November of 2019, before the actual effective date of the law, because and like I say, they didn't want the spectacle of all these people coming out. So what happened, by January 1st, every person, oh, I'm sorry, am I going too long?
No, because this is really tying together a whole
All right, I'll talk faster. On January 1st, on January 1st of 2020, every person charged with car theft was released from Rikers Island. Every person charged with burglary in the second degree, which is a residential burglary, and burglary in the third degree, which is a store burglary, was released from Rikers Island. Every drug dealer charged with criminal sale of a controlled substance, or criminal possession of a controlled substance, even A felonies, was released from Rikers Island. Every person charged with a misdemeanor was released from Rikers Island. Every single one of them. And that all happened at once. So now what happened between January 1st of 2020, when all these people were released, and March 15th of 2020, now this is before COVID, all right? Before all the lockdowns and everybody was told to stay home and the schools were closed and restaurants were closed. By March 15th of 2020, car theft went up 66%, burglary went up 33%, robbery went up, I forget the name, it was like 25%. Every crime for which those people were released went up by enormous amounts. And that the numbers of these additional crimes were ridiculous. There were hundreds more burglaries, hundreds more robberies, petty larcenies. There were 3,000 more petty larcenies than the year before in the same period of time. So all those people were released. COVID comes on, I think March 18th is when the lockdowns come, and everybody gets frightened, and everybody's told to stay home. Throughout the rest of the year, crime continues to go up. 2021 comes, crime continues to go up. The problem that Mayor Adams has, I know you're not going to get to all the questions, but the problems that Mayor Adams...
all the questions.
Okay. The problem that Mayor Adams has is that he cannot do anything without a change in the bail law and keeping Rikers Island open. It's ludicrous to think that you can release another 2,500 people from Rikers Island in order to close it and build these community jails. It's ludicrous to think that. And it's also ludicrous to think that you can release 2,500 car thieves from car thieves, burglars, drug dealers, and petty larcenists from jail, and sit there and say, well, the fact that car theft, petty larceny, drug dealing, and burglary went up is not related to that. So that's the major problem that he has. And if he can't change the bail laws, which I'm very skeptical that they're going to do it because they are so intent on closing Rikers down.
Right.
If they change the bail laws, the population in the city jails is going to go up and not down. And they're never going to be able to build the 4 jails that they want.
So really, enforcement choices on Adams' part is such a small picture of why crime has gone up, that without the prosecution side and the incarceration side, it's no wonder he's sort of spinning his wheels with emphasis on policing.
Some of the other things that they passed in the bail laws that are also creating problems. New York County in 2021 dismissed 80% of the misdemeanor arrests that they chose to prosecute. These are ones that the cops brought to them. They arrested somebody. They wrote everything up. Mm-hmm. They dismissed 80% of those cases because of the new discovery laws that are hampering DA's offices all around the city of New York. Queens, I know they dismissed 75% of the misdemeanor cases. Normally that number would be down about 20%, 25%. But that means 4 out of every 5 misdemeanor arrests result in no punishment and no record for the defendant. And that's like a major thing.
Can you talk about discovery a bit? I know it's connected to the New York Times just reported this week that a fifth of the line prosecutors in Manhattan and Brooklyn and the Bronx, and I'm sure a substantial amount in Queens and Staten Island as well, quit just in the past year, and discovery is surely connected to it. So will you talk about
what discovery did? It required ADAs to hand over an enormous amount of paperwork to the defense. Originally, it was within 15 days of arrest. It was later changed to 45 days for felonies and I think 30 days for misdemeanors. But all this material had to be turned over very, very quickly. In the old days, in 2019, that material, all of that material had to be turned over just before you went to trial. DAs were turning over a lot of material before that, but everything had to be turned over just before you went to trial, which could be a year later. Now they require them to do it within 15 to 45 days on every case. Most cases plead out, and you don't have a trial, so you don't have that grand discovery obligation, which is getting every piece of police paperwork, every police-worn, body-worn camera, statements of every witness, police reports on every witness, any toxicological reports and data on everybody you're going to call as a witness has to be turned over.
Right?
Memo books from the cops, everything. It's an enormous amount of stuff. I mean, the Queen's DA's office said that they handed over 1.6 million documents to the defense in 2021. And you know, I know they're not reading that. I know they're not looking at those videos. Right. But it's turned ADAs into just paper collectors and, you know, just gathering material for the defense on cases that they know are going to plead out and are not going to go to trial. I mean, there were 20,000 arrests, misdemeanor arrests in Queens, I think, in 2019. Mm-hmm. I think we did 150 trials, both jury and non-jury. So the discovery obligation, the main discovery obligation really only applied to those 150 trials. Now it applies to all 20,000 of them. So all this material has to be turned over, and if it's not turned over, the DA's offices, we have something called speedy trial. If they're not ready for trial within a certain amount of time, the case gets dismissed. And that's what's happening with these cases. They are unable to fulfill this discovery obligation because it's just too onerous. And because they can't fulfill it, they can't answer ready for trial. Because they can't answer ready for trial, the cases get dismissed. And that's happening on misdemeanors, and it's happening a lot more on felonies. 20% of the felony cases are getting dismissed. I mean, it's ludicrous when you really think about it in practice. It's meaningless, but the discovery law was essentially written by the Legal Aid Society in 2009. And it was when the state Senate changed hands and became Democrat that they were able to get it passed through the state legislature. The Republicans were always able to put it off. But legal aid, they literally wrote it. And they renumbered the statute and everything. And that their entire plan was just put into the criminal procedure law.
And it is beneficial for defense attorneys.
It's very beneficial for defense attorneys because it delays everything. It makes it harder for ADAs to be able to answer ready for trial and go to trial. And once they get dismissed, the case is over, and it can't be revived. And you know that's part of the reason that crime just continues to go up. And I mean, there are just so many problems with what they did to the criminal justice system, and you know I don't understand why. I just don't.
Well, on that, you know, so you have so much good data showing why these choices and these laws have led to more crime, less public safety. But what is the data that gets thrown around that Alvin Bragg says, that Stuart Cousins says when they say there's only 2% reoffending?
Pardon me,
I know you've given this thought.
While I drink my gin. The data that when they passed the bail law, the state legislature passed a law saying that the Office of Court Administration had to keep data on reoffending rates of the defendants who were released on bail, so that we could study it and we could look at it. And what people like Andrea Stewart Cousins and Alvin Bragg have done, they take one data point out of all that data and cite it over and over again, and the news media repeats it over and over again. Just say that there are 100,000 people arrested in New York State. That's not the real number, but just say that there are 100,000 people arrested in New York State. if 4% of them get rearrested while their case is pending for a violent felony offense, that's the number that they say. Only 4% of them got rearrested for a violent felony offense out of the 100,000. Now, that's true. That's an accurate number. But it's a meaningless number. It's like saying, I tried to think of something to compare this to, but it's like saying in the United States, 1 million people died of COVID. There are 330 million people in the United States. So that means that the COVID death rate is, what, 0.03%, whatever it is, 1 out of every 330. But then you got to think about it. Well, not everybody got COVID. So that's not the real death rate. So maybe, say, half of them got COVID. So now the death rate gets halved. It's 1 out of every 150. Well, that's really not accurate either, because we're not sure that that's the right number of people who got it. So let's look at the people who went to the hospital and died. It's a different COVID rate. And then if you look at the people who had comorbidities, there's a much higher rate. So what I did, I went to their website.
The Office of Court
The Office of Court Administration website. It's there, everybody can go on it. And I looked at the people who in the past, in 2019, would have had bail set on them. Not everybody has bail set. You get arrested for your first misdemeanor, you're ROR'd. Second misdemeanor, you're ROR'd.
Released
Third
on your own
misdemeanor,
recognizance.
you're released. No bail, nothing, all right? That's a fact. You get arrested for your first car theft, you're released. Your first nonviolent felony, you're released, or a minimal bail is set. It's only people who have criminal records or who are at risk of flight that had bail set under the old law. Under the old law, the judges could set bail on anybody for any crime, but it all, had to be in their under certain circumstances. So, but my phone is ringing in my ears. So what I did was I looked at people who came through the system who were arrested for, say, burglary in the third degree, which is a judge can't set bail. They're arrested for burglary in the third degree. They have a prior conviction or pending case. This is like the comorbidity, all right? A judge has looked at them and said, I think that you are a risk of flight. A judge then can't set bail on him, but he can put him in what's called non-monetary release. That means the judge looks at him and says, all right, you have to report to a counselor every week. You have to do this. You have to get a job. You have to stay employed, whatever. Puts conditions on him. Those are the people who would have had bail set under the old law by the judges. So I looked at the people who got non-monetary release for burglary in the third degree, and then I looked at their rearrest rate, and their rearrest rate was 57%.
More
then
than
I looked
two.
at, I'm sorry?
More than 4%.
More than 4%, yeah. And then I looked at people charged with petty larceny, the same thing. They have prior or pending case, and a judge put them in non-monetary release. Their rearrest rate was 67%. So then I looked at almost every crime. I just looked at felonies generally. And I said, all right, you're arrested for any felony. I don't care what it is, and you've got a prior criminal record or a pending case, and a judge thinks that you're a flight risk, and he puts you in this non-monetary release. Any felony, the rearrest rate was 43%. Now, those are the people who a judge would have set bail on in the past. They're now released in this non-monetary release program, and they are reoffending at a rate of 43%. It's not 4%, it's not 2%, it's not 1%. And when they throw out those numbers, they are misrepresenting and misusing them. And they are doing it specifically because they don't want to take blame for what they've done to the city of New York with these bail laws. And as long as they can keep that number out there, and as long as people keep repeating it, they feel that they're safe.
Well, we've run into Q&A, but I think it was well worth it because I feel like that's something that's been confusing to everyone because your eyes, what you're seeing on the street don't match what you're hearing. So Q&A, please. And do I call on? I'm sorry, or do, yes, please. Yes.
First of all, great comments. Thank you very much. I'm Steve Klinsky. what is the trend in other cities? Isn't crime going up in other cities that don't have Rikers Island and don't have these same bail rules? So what's going on more?
It depends. I mean, New York City has always been an outlier. Chicago's crime rate has been going up for years and years and years. Baltimore's crime rate went up after the Freddie Gray case, when the prosecutor there locked up 10 cops. You can trace the rise in crime in Baltimore almost from that day. That's when homicides quadrupled. Philadelphia, crime started going up when Larry Krasner, who was a progressive DA, got elected. It's almost from the day that the day that he got elected, you started to see crime go up. New York City has always been an outlier. New York City's crime had been going down up until 2019. And there had been minor fluctuations, maybe 5% up, 5% down, something like that, but nothing like what we're seeing now. Crime over last year is up 44%. I mean, that's ridiculous. That should not be.
Yes.
Okay, if you listen to Andrea Stewart Cousins, okay, who used to be my state senator, so you could blame me. I didn't vote for her, but from my area. These bail reform involves young kids who can't afford to post bail and then are placed in cells with hardened criminals, and this perpetuates the criminality. Okay, so that's the definition that we're hearing, so that the bail reform has nothing to do with rising crimes. Okay, but with your numbers of who left Rikers, who was sent out of Rikers, according to her definition, they were all young kids who were too poor to pay post bail and was sent in with hardened criminals. But I take it that's not the case.
No. Surprisingly, no. In fact, we did a study when all this bail stuff was coming around and they were looking to release people from Rikers. My office did a study on who was in Rikers. The Manhattan DA's office did one too. And the people who are in Rikers have extensive criminal records. They're not first offenders, and as I said at one point, they're also not last offenders. I mean, they are people who commit crime routinely. The people who are in on, say, A misdemeanors had an average of 12 prior convictions. The people who are in on E felonies had, I believe, 7 prior convictions. One of them was a felony. D felony, the car thieves, those types of people. The felony numbers were all, the re-arrest numbers were all in the same range. The more, we're talking 7, 8 prior arrests. And a lot of the people who are in Rikers, if you talk to corrections, which I did, I talked to corrections a lot of the people on Rikers who were had bail set, their family could make the bail back then, but they didn't want to because the person who was in was a problem for them, and they didn't want to post the bail for him to get him out. And we're not talking about young innocents being held on Rikers Island. They're just not. And now because I've released all the misdemeanor guys and the E felonies and the D felonies, the ones that are left, I mean, my God, that's why Rikers is going as crazy as it is, because the people who are there are violent, and they are a danger, and they're going to let another 2,500 of them out. You tell me how it makes sense.
Yes, back there.
So you just brought it up as well. So it's interesting to me, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, that poor people or people who have family members that don't want to post their bail, they're stuck in prison, but the woman who pushed the elderly woman down and killed her the other week is sitting at home. So I'm curious, it seems we keep talking about bail, but shouldn't it be about kind of remand or the supervisor, like all of these other tactics, rather than just, in my opinion, money shouldn't make the difference as to whether you're sitting at home or not. I don't want a dangerous person on the street, and we're not talking about dangerousness. We keep talking about money, and that's where, and I get your point about family members, but like that person, if they had a family member that didn't talk to them forever but paid them out, that's not fair either. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
No, I think, a lot of states have that option where it's either remand or you're released into some kind of supervised release program. That's better than what we have now, but under current law, a judge can't even consider remand for probably 70% of the defendants. Just by law, it's not an option, no matter what their record is.
Remand being when the defendant is held in without bail, just held in by order of the judge.
Sorry about that. But that is an option that's available in, I think Jersey does that, and a lot of other states do that. And almost every other state in the union allows a judge to consider dangerousness or risk of reoffending when they're determining whether or not to let the defendant out or let him in. There may be circumstances where the family is an intact family and the defendant is, it may not be a danger, where you might want to have something other than just in or out. You might want to have some other control over him, and having the family's house being put at stake sometimes, works to modify that defendant's behavior when he's out. So, I think that what we need is a whole list of options. I think that the way that the debate gets framed all the time is, well, it's just poor people are in and rich people are out. Well, that's not always true, too. I mean, if a guy's rich, the judge is going to set $1 million bail on him. And if a judge wants a guy in, he's going to set bail that he can't make. That's the reality. And that's what happened before they changed the bail laws. The judge would look at a defendant and say, either I want him in or I want him out. Well, if he can make $100,000, I'm setting $250,000. And that's what would be done. And it was almost like a remand. But now that option is not available. That complete option was taken away from them.
Well, this breaks my heart, but we only have time for one more question. You've had your hand up since the very beginning. I invite everyone to bum rush Jim after the next panel after ours is finished at the end of the program. Yes.
In Casablanca, Claude Rain says, Major Strasser has been shot. Round up the usual suspects. So I always thought that, the police know who the bad guys are, and it sounds like from your statistics that the same people commit the crimes again and again. And if they're let out, they do it, and if they're not let out, the crime goes down. So now that they're let out, what happens with bench warrants? Are there rampant bench warrants now? These people never show up for court? Is that what happens?
It depends. I mean, on desk appearance tickets, which is replaced arrests for misdemeanors. A cop, if it doesn't arrest people for misdemeanor, he gives you a summons, basically, and you're supposed to appear in court. The non-appearance rate on those is about 25%. The rate on regular felonies, it's somewhere between, it varies between 8 and 20% of defendants not showing up. The problem is that most defendants are going to show up, and you're right. DAs know who's doing it. We know the people who are committing the crimes. And, it's not like, New York City had 13,000 burglaries last year. There are only 300 people on Rikers charged with burglary. Now, we don't have 13,000 burglars in New York City. We would find guys charged with burglary with 20, 30 burglaries. We knew they did it because it was the same MO. Sometimes their DNA was found. But it's a small number of people. But the problem is that there's no way to deal with them pre-trial. And you couple that with the changes in discovery, which is resulting in a whole bunch of cases being dismissed. It's a disaster. It's just a disaster.
The discovery sounds like a disaster. But if the bench warrants aren't horrible and they are still coming back, why don't they get convicted and go to jail? And then crime rates should go down if they're convicted. Because really, they're only supposed to go to jail when they're found guilty. Right?
Because it can take 1.5 years for a simple burglary case to go to trial. And now with the new discovery laws, 20% of them are being dismissed, because we can't comply with discovery. They're out. They're committing crimes while they're out, even though we know that they're going to. I mean, the city had a I don't want to go any further, but the city had an algorithm where they could predict the people who were going to be committing crimes. They had it. And in all these discussions about bail and everything, the city was saying that they were going to use this algorithm because it predicted who would appear for court and who wouldn't, and who was most likely to commit a crime and who wasn't. But what happened was when they calculated what it was going to do to the prison population, it turned out that they were going to be putting more people in jail than previously, so they just abandoned it completely.
It was the wrong algorithm for where they were trying to get to.
Yes.
Are there also less plea bargains taken now because you don't have to plead guilty, because you're not in jail, and because you're going to get your case dismissed anyway?
Well, I mean, the incentive to plead is out because you're out, and the longer a case floats around, the harder it is for DAs to get a conviction.
Well, join me in thanking Jim Quinn for explaining and pressing at the same time.
Sorry.
Thank you, and please enjoy
Thank
the
you.
last panel.
Excuse me.
Jason, I'll time cue you during the panel, and then I'll time cue you again during Q&A.
Okay. Sounds good. Okay, good, thanks. Just start. Okay. Hello, everyone. Just wanted to keep things moving along here. My name is Jason Riley. I'm a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and thank you. And I think this discussion we're about to have is a good one to dovetail with the one that just took place on crime. I'm of the opinion that if Mayor Adams gets crime and education right, he'll probably get reelected. His predecessor went to war against the police department, went to war against the best performing schools in the city. All Adams has to do is not do that, and I think he'll be just fine. But we'll see. And the other reason I think it dovetails is because getting education right can go a long way toward the crime problem. I mean, frankly, our jails and prisons are not full of college graduates. They're not full of high school graduates. Simply getting a kid through high school can go a long way toward limiting or eliminating his involvement with the criminal justice system later in life. So I think these two panels go well together. And so I am thrilled to be here to discuss one of my favorite topics, education, and to discuss it with one of my favorite education reformers, Joel Klein. Many of you are familiar with Joel, but for those who aren't, he's had a very long and distinguished career. He's currently senior advisor at insurance company Oscar Health. He's also held senior roles at media companies like Bertelsmann and News Corp. But we've asked him here today because of his work in the public sector. Joel was New York City's schools chancellor for a decade under Mayor Mike Bloomberg. And frankly, he was one of the best things to happen in public education for this city in a long time. Not only New York City, but nationally. A lot of people under his direction went off all over the country and are doing very good work in the education sector. Under his leadership here, underperforming schools were closed, charter schools expanded, test scores rose, graduation rates went up by more than 40%, which is why I can't think of a better person to ask about the current state of K through 12 education in the city. So thank you for being here, Joel. I thought we could start by stepping back a little and looking at the state of the school system that Eric Adams inherited. What did you and Mayor Bloomberg leave to the de Blasio administration? What did they do with it? And what did they hand off to Eric Adams?
Sure. So first of all, thank you and the Manhattan Institute for inviting me here. You know, when you're an ex-chancellor, you get invited nowhere. So it's nice to be sort of like in Hello, Dolly, back where you belong. Second of all, I was thinking about the connection between the last panel and this one. And there is another connection in addition to the two you mentioned, and that is, in many ways, what's going on in K-12 education today is a crime. And so I want to talk candidly about that, because if we don't fix that, we really are going to have, the problems we have now are going to be intensified enormously. And frankly, I do think the handoff from our administration to de Blasio and de Blasio to now has really been in the wrong direction, to just put it right out there. If you look at just a simple statistic, one that I think people won't really challenge, the national exams, the NAEP scores. These are basically seen as a gold standard in testing. And whatever one's particular views about testing, these reflect, I think, in a meaningful way, not in a perfect, but a meaningful way, what's going on in the educational system. They test them for urban districts in every couple of years, in 4th and 8th grade math and reading. Under Mike Bloomberg's 12 years, the scores went up basically in statistically significant ways in every grade. In the lower grades, they went up 10 points, and in the upper grades, they went up a handful, 6, 7, 8 points. Under the de Blasio administration, they went down in every one of those over the next 6 years, basically, that people were tested. In that tells you an enormous amount about what's going on in the system. Now you add into it the impact of COVID and the fact that here are kids who, when they were in school, many kids growing up in minority communities and poor communities, these kids were having a hell of a hard time when they were in school. Can you imagine what it was like when they were out of school? So for a lot of these kids, they've lost a major part of their education, which they couldn't afford today. They've lost a significant part of the last 2 years. So in that respect, the current administration inherits, I think, an enormous amount of challenge, and I think they're going to have to make big changes in order to be able to really start to see the kind of results we all want to see.
Big changes beginning where?
Well, beginning, for example, with charter schools, right? This is ridiculous. You've got a cap on charter schools. Why don't they call it what it is? It's a cap on excellence. It's a cap on opportunity. It's a cap on giving families a chance. When I started as chancellor, there were probably a few thousand kids in charter schools in New York. Today, there are over 150,000 kids. That's bigger than almost all but a handful of school districts in America. Every one of those kids chose that charter school, right? They were all assigned to PS9, PS11, PS22. Their parents, supposedly almost invariably parents in communities of color, parents of kids who are poor, that's where these schools are located. They chose them, right? They knew enough to figure out they had to get their kid out of the district school and into the charter. Today, there are probably another 20, 30,000 people on waiting lists, and yet we've got a cap on charter schools, an inability. And you know what that sends a message to the KIPs and the Uncommons and the others? We're not open for business. Yeah. Who's going to pay the price for that? Yeah. The price is going to be paid by those kids on the waiting list who are going to have to take a school they didn't want to go to and get an education that isn't going to do anything for them. So start with that.
Chancellor Banks' background involves starting not a charter school, but a network of schools that was somewhat independent from the public school system in New York under the Bloomberg administration. Right. I believe this was started. Do you think that sort of background will help him? Do you think it's something he will channel into his new job? Is he going to bring a certain mindset to the job based on that experience?
So David Banks, who I took a lot of heat for him because these were sort of single-gender schools, and people were not into that at that particular time. But he had the foresight to be able to say, in a city like ours, let's create a multitude of opportunities. He created Eagle and several Eagle successors, primarily focused on African-American young men. And I give him a lot of credit for that because, one, as I said, you took political heat on the front end, and second of all, took a lot of courage to kind of go out there and create a new model, expose yourself, which he did. So yeah, I think he brings to it both an experience, and I know him personally, and a passion that's justified. Here he is, an African-American school chancellor in a district where African-American kids are often not remotely getting the education they need, and that's something he cares deeply about. So going into it, I am optimistic.
Okay. From what I can tell, the new administration is certainly talking the talk. I mean, we just mentioned Banks. He said things that we all know are true, but are seldom said aloud. He's talked about how big the school budget is, $38 billion, yet 2/3 of Black and Hispanic kids aren't reading it at doing math at grade level. That's something we've all known for a while, but few people in his position would dare say it out loud. I spoke with some of the school reformers in the city, heads of charter school networks. They're cautiously optimistic about the new administration, but there's the cap in place. He's going to need Albany's help, really, the governor's help in doing this. Do you, so far, I mean, we're 100 days in. I think this weekend it'll be 100 days. Are they taking the right steps right now to do something about that charter cap? It's kind of out of their hands right now, right?
Look, it's a hard hand to play, so it's very easy. I used to watch others do it to me. I'm not going to do it so easily. It's very easy to sit out there and criticize people who've got to navigate a legislature, a teachers union, and so forth and so on. The answer to your question is yes, they are making the right moves. It's early, and the question in this game is, you said they're talking the talk. They are talking the talk. We got to see them doing the do, and that's what it'll come down to. But I have the feeling that they understand nobody ever solved the problem if she didn't scope it properly. I think they've scoped it, and that's an important first step. I think they're being strategic. They're putting down markers. That's an important second step. Now I think they're going to have to do the hard work of building the coalitions, getting this cap lifted, creating more options, doing the kinds of things. You know, David's talking about it, I talked about it. It's an amazing thing to me to think kids coming out of the 3rd grade in this city can't read. I mean, you know, this whole line, which we all use, from 0 to grade 3, it's you got to learn to read, then from 3 on, you read to learn. Well, if a kid can't read, what the hell is going to happen for that kid in her life? So I think the answer is yes, but I don't want to be Pollyannish about how steep the climb is and how we have to modulate what we can expect. But what we can expect is to move the ball down the field, not in the opposite direction, which is what's happened over the last several years.
One more question about Banks and what advice you might have for him. I remember many years ago interviewing Judge Mukasey after he had become Attorney General.
Right.
And he said, I thought I was pretty aware of a lot of the threats the nation's faced and so forth. I had been a judge during the first bombing of the World Trade Center and so forth. He said, but when you become U.S. Attorney General, the threat assessment you have access to, he said, it just blew my mind. I had no idea what was coming at me. What's coming at Banks that he has no idea in terms of the challenges he's going to face? What was the biggest shock for you after taking over that job?
Well, look, what's coming at him is a mountain of heat. That he's a tough guy. He'll weather the heat. But here's what's coming at him. You know, when I went back in the day when I was general counsel of the American Psychiatric Association, people basically had to have a light bulb joke, you know, and my light bulb joke was, how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is only one, but the light bulb really has to want to change. And the thing that really astonished me, I walk into a school district. Look, I wasn't an educator. I mean, I'd gone to school in the Astoria, Queens. But, you know, I thought Bloomberg got the wrong name when he called me and told me he was going to make me chancellor, because I had all the same preparation to be a school chancellor I did to do open heart surgery. And if you see me in a hospital, choose anybody else, I promise you. So I said, but here I think, most of these kids who grew up in poverty, most of these kids in New York, we're talking, let's be honest about this, almost all of these kids are children of color, right? I mean, between Latino and African-American kids, you're talking close to 3/4 of the district. And these kids, they're going nowhere. The graduation rate when I got there had been flatlined at 50%. And to graduate, you just basically had to find the bathroom and the cafeteria, and they give you your graduation credentials. So this wasn't that hard. And so I thought, well, Jesus, everybody's going to want to change this. I mean, if you keep doing the same old, nobody wanted to change it. You know, what they wanted me to do as chancellor was not to change the system, give them better kids. It's hard to find better kids. I mean, I got the ones they gave me. So it seemed to me a little difficult to do what they wanted. But I literally would go to meetings and people would say, you know, Chancellor, you want better results? Give us better kids. That is what he's going to face. A people satisfied with a status quo for other people's children that they would never tolerate. for their own children. And that is what he's going to face, and it's going to feel very Sisyphean to him. It's going to be not just how heavy it is to push the rock up, but it's going to start rolling back down on him. And that's what I think he's got to be prepared for. And he's got to be strategic. That's why this charter thing, if you ask me the things that I'm proud of, to this day, I mean, it's been almost 12 years now since I've been school chancellor. To this day, every 6 months or 8 months, somebody will stop me on the street and say, Chancellor, I just want to tell you, you changed my kid's life. Now, I wish I had changed a whole lot more lives, but by giving people these options, 150,000 plus people in charter schools, those are life-changing events. And that's what he's got to start to plan on. What are the impact? If you take what we did in charters and what we did with small high schools, those two initiatives, I have no doubt, will have long-term enduring effects. If you ask me where on the sort of scale of 100 points, how far we got, I'd say probably 25, 30, maybe 35 if I wanted to be generous to myself. But that's progress, and that's what he's got, and it's got to be sustained progress. The thing you learn is the next mayor, he or she may have an entirely different agenda, but they can't, the one thing they won't take away is a school where parents want to send their kids. Those high schools, you know, my 8F grading system, he could jettison that in a nanosecond. But when I created over 100 high schools and way over 100 charter schools, they're here to stay. And so that's what David's got to be looking for.
So you mentioned inertia, the status quo being his biggest challenge. And of course, the biggest protector of the status quo are the teachers' unions. They're a very powerful force in the city. And I'm wondering how you think the unions handled COVID. Did they overplay their hand? Do you anticipate any kind of political backlash for that? Is there a moment here to take advantage of? We've seen some elections around the country. We've seen some school board recalls. We've seen some governor's races. We've seen some agitated parents out there. I'm wondering how you assess the union's performance during COVID and whether there's an opportunity here for school reformers.
Look, I think there is. Again, I don't want to be Pollyannish. I mean, you're talking about an enormously powerful, entrenched union. You're talking about not just in and of itself, but its connections in Albany. And, you know, I'll never forget on one deal, Joe Bruno, who was then head of the Republican who controlled the Senate, and assured me there was no way this bill would get through until I watched the union pick off one after another of his members. But yes, and what happened in San Francisco recently on the school board sure makes people happy about the fact that maybe things can come back in the right direction. But again, you've got to build the coalitions. You've got to get the city to the point where people understand. We can talk all we want about equality. We can talk all we want about Black Lives Matter. We can talk all we want about whatever we want. We do not change the education system for these kids. This is all we're doing is talking. This is a cocktail party. And so you've got to build the coalitions. You've got to get people in the legislature, and you've got an African-American mayor and an African-American school chancellor. And I think that's terrific. I really do. And I think it's important that the city want them to succeed. And Jason, you said it at the outset. There are two issues that they will be measured by. They will be measured by safety, and they'll be measured by schools. And I think it's time for people to let people in the legislature, let people in the city know that we're not going to tolerate a status quo that underserves our neediest kids. And I think he's got to build those coalitions. And frankly, just be candid about it, I think it's easy for a person of color to do it than a white guy.
But I'm wondering, in a bigger picture, has the political debate surrounding school reform shifted? I mean, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, had Arne Duncan. These were pro-charter Democrats.
Yes.
You're getting a very different flavor out of the Biden administration, the ascendant progressives in the Democratic Party right now. They are quite anti-charter. They want moratoriums. They're more concerned about other things. I'm someone who's always thought this education debate was largely a debate occurring on the left among Democrats themselves, the more centrist versus the more progressive wing. And right now, the progressives seem ascendant. Have you noticed a shift? Is there as much of a reform instinct within the Democratic Party as there was in previous eras like yours?
No, you're absolutely. Look, it was Bush 1 brought this all together way back in the day, and it was something of a Faustian bargain in the following sense. The Democratic leadership, Clinton and others, said, we'll go as far as charters, but no further. We're not going to voucherize the system, et cetera, et cetera. But when I came in, for example, you look at, Race to the Top, Arnie Duncan, Barack Obama, those were people who were reformers. I mean, they weren't radical reformers, they were reformers. Elizabeth Warren back in the day wrote a book all about giving people vouchers. So that whole thing has shifted. The other thing that's shifted and is very corrosive is measurement. If you don't measure it, you don't know how kids do. You can pretend everything is hunky-dory. This whole anti-testing, everything, I don't know if you saw it, was a great piece in the Atlantic just the other day, where MIT, after jettisoning the SATs, all of a sudden woke up and said, this is the worst thing that happened to poor kids is the elimination of these tests, because all the other kinds of things, they do worse. So we've got to reverse. If you don't have a way to measure performance, how the hell you know how these kids are going to do until it's way too late? And the Democratic Party, frankly, is not at the forefront of those issues anymore.
Do you like what you're hearing out of the Adams administration on the specialized schools debate here in the city? I mean, because what you're really describing is an attack on meritocracy, so to speak. This effort to eliminate the test at these schools, go after gifted and talented programs in middle school. And this, again, is played out. It played out in Virginia, Thomas Jefferson High School. It's not just these specialized schools in New York. Even out in San Francisco, you have, up in Boston, you have these specialized schools that are coming under attack, and that's happening here in the city as well. And I wanted to ask you about that debate, along with the fact that a group that seems to be expressing itself more loudly and more directly, which are Asian parents. Right. And what you make of that development, because that has been a huge issue here in the city, but not just here in the city. It's going on nationwide because, of course, their kids are the ones that are overperforming in school and getting into these schools at higher rates. And when people come along and say, no, we need more racial balance, what they're really saying is we need fewer Asian students in these schools.
Well, that's a mouthful. So let's unpack it a little bit. First of all, you think about the issue of equality. There's two ways to achieve equality. One, you can dumb things down and say everybody is now performing at a reasonably high level. I remember when the former president of France said, no more homework, because homework favors the higher performing kids. Now, there's a winning formula for you, I'll tell you. So destroying Stuyvesant or Bronx Science or Brooklyn Tech or Lehman or whatever, what do you accomplish? You're not, in other words, you're hurting institutions that work really well. And we'll come to the Asian piece. And look, if we want to improve education for children of color, children who grow up in poverty, the solution is to improve it for them. But don't set a different bar, which is both contemptuous of them and making it much more difficult on the system by saying, basically, you don't have to measure up. Just get them up to here when you should be getting them up to here. So now you can feel good you got them up to here. Well, who's going to be helped by that? So I start with that. The second thing, when you think about these schools disproportionately get Title I kids. This is not sort of people walking off the Upper West Side, living on Central Park West, doing hunky-dory in life that are going to these schools. There's a lot of kids that come from high poverty backgrounds and so forth who see this as their ticket up and out. And so they got a legitimate bitch, it seems to me. And so I think the administration is right to get behind it. And I guarantee you, other than the fact that it's a symbolic thing, I mean, I used to get killed every year on this, because New York Times used to write a headline about, basically number African-American and Latino kids in Stuyvesant, so it would be basically admissions occur and African American, Latino have almost nobody there. The fact of the matter was almost 65, 70% of the kids were Asian. So in fact, even white people were not doing so well. Of course, that didn't make it in the headlines, but what the hell. So my point only being that attacking that is not going to fix the problem. The problem is massive undereducation for all these children, for the 72% of the kids of color and the probably 60, 70% of kids who are high poverty kids in New York City. If you don't fix that problem, you can fix the headlines, but you haven't done a damn thing, and you're actually going to hurt people. If you want to make a bet today on which school or schools will have the most Nobel Prize winners in the next 50 years, take a look at Thomas Jefferson, take a look at Boston Latin, take a look at Stuyvesant, take a look at Bronx Science, take a look at Tech. So why blow them up? What will you achieve? You'll achieve the false comfort of numbers without substance.
One final question before we turn it over to audience Q&A is, and this again relates to the previous panel, but we've been having this national debate about policing in this country, but there's also been concern here in the city in particular about school safety. What role, if any, do you think that law enforcement has in keeping schools safe in the city? So
I start with the first thing. I mean, one of the things I hated most about being chancellor, other than reading the newspapers, was
except the Wall Street Journal.
Except the Wall Street Journal editorial page. Only the editorial page. No, one of the things I hated is to walk into a school and have to go through a magnetometer. I mean, it just, I felt for those kids. My heart, what's it like to think you're going to prison on your way to school? They're doing a metallic fleece on you. So safety has got to be an essential, I mean, these are table stakes. An unsafe school. When I went to schools, I used to ask kids all the time, particularly in high school, who runs this school? Almost never did you hear the principal. I mean, that was not like a possible out. So yeah, I hate to over law enforcement it. I would like to think we can create cultures of safety in our schools. But if you have to, I would say you law enforce it. Because if it's not, I'm not sending my kids to school. You're not sending your kids to school that's not safe. It's crazy. And these kids, it ain't going to happen. So that's an essential prerequisite, but really, as I say, table stakes. That ain't going to educate kids. That's going to make it possible to educate kids.
Yeah, no learning's going to take place in a school where fights are breaking out every 5 minutes, so we do have some time for questions, and I think someone has a mic, I believe. Okay, so we can start over here.
So today we've been talking about, what is the advice to Mayor Adams, or how to move his promises forward, and yet, regardless of whether it's criminal justice reform or what we do with the subways or congestion pricing or education reform, the state has a huge role to play, right? I mean, the state is making a lot of laws that constrain New York. So what would be your suggestion to the mayor and his team of how to avoid, how to avoid the utter dysfunction of the relationship that the former mayor and governor had to move some of these policies forward? How can he build that coalition that you mentioned to make progress?
So it's a great question, and the answer is, I think, sort of like porcupine's mating. You build it carefully. And so what you have to do is spend the time. If I were going to be self-critical, one of the things I should have done much more of is spend the time with people in Albany, getting them more familiar with the challenges we face, trying to build the support. I think, Bloomberg did that, I think, pretty effectively, actually, in terms of being able to go negotiate, deal, get people on side, compromise when you have to compromise. All these things used to be possible in politics. I grew up in Washington politics, not New York politics. But right now, none of this is possible anywhere, it seems to me. But I think Adams has got to do this. I think, obviously, he's got a question of who's going to be the next governor, but assuming you get a moderate governor in the state, you know, for all the noise, the state, if you look at the mayoral election, the city didn't go far left. It went smack center on probably the top two candidates were centrists. So I think you got to start to build a coalition, and you've just got to rally people. It's very hard to do, but you've got to take the time to build the coalitions with the community groups, with the people. I mean, Ray, who invited me today, I got to know him through work he was doing, you know, in the community, and I learned an enormous amount. I think the first time I met him was in the Bronx, where I hadn't been since I was 2 years old and moved out of the Bronx, or when I went with my father Yankee. So I don't know any other way to do it in democracy, but take the time, build the coalitions, try to get political leverage, get the money to flow to candidates who you're supportive of. It's a pain in the rear, but I don't know any other way to do it. And, you know, hoping and wishing is not an effective strategy.
Right here.
New York spends a lot of money on the schools. What are the three or four things you would suggest in order to improve the performance of the schools themselves, and so we get a better bang for the buck? Second of all, do you have any comments about the new chancellor? Do you know him?
I do know him, and I like him a lot, and I really hold out a lot of hope. Jason pointed out properly, I mean, he started Eagle, which was, again, not an easy play. It's a high-risk play in K-12, and he did it, and I give him a lot of credit. He's willing to be chancellor, and let me tell you, it ain't an easy job, and I give him a lot of credit for that. And as I said before, I think he cares legitimately and responsibly about the plight of particularly children of color in the city, having been one and grown up one himself. So all of that, I think, augurs well. If I were going to do this, look, there's no magic formula. But one, I would definitely do the charter thing. Two, someday, somehow, we have to create a profession called teaching, not a trade union model of teaching. We've got to reward. If I pay you the exact same thing to work in my most challenging school or to teach at PS6 up here on the Upper East, and you get exactly the same, what are you going to pick? I mean, unless you're Mother Teresa, we know where you're going to work. So you got to professionalize it, meaning I've got to incentivize people to do. I got in trouble all the time. I got killed for this. I said, I pay the same thing to a physical education teacher as I do to a math teacher. I got one problem. I got all the phys ed teachers I need, and I can't get any math teachers. So if I don't get math teachers, who do you think doesn't get math teachers? It's not the kids at PS6. It's not the kids down in Tribeca. It's the kids who live in the South Bronx and Central Brooklyn and so forth. And so let me pay more. I mean, you think as the chancellor I shouldn't want to pay more, but I need to pay more. You don't have great teachers, it ain't gonna work. I don't care what else, it ain't gonna. Second thing we gotta take a hard look at is curriculum. We're teaching kids garbage, and if you teach them garbage, they ain't gonna learn. We gotta be really hard about what curriculums, what knowledge base we're departing to kids. Those are the kinds of things that I think can change education. They're very hard because there's a lot of people pushing back against that. But if you want to know what I think matters, those are the things that I think matter.
But just a quick follow-up on that.
What about rubber rooms?
Yeah, rubber rooms is like Steve Brill wrote the great definitive piece on this in the New Yorker, so I get it. Look, rubber rooms are just a symptom of a broken system, right? That I would pay people not to work because it was cheaper than paying them to work. And the reason it was cheaper was because I wouldn't let my kids go near them. I mean, but that ain't, the thing that's gonna fix it is a profession that holds itself to standards, that understands accountability, that believes in self-improvement. When I got to be chancellor, teachers would say to me, Chancellor, I've been here for 20 years. And I said, what am I supposed to conclude from that? They said, I know my thing. I know how to do my thing. I said, well, look, the system better get better. And the only way I know for it to get better is for all of us to get better every day. And they'd look at me like I had three heads. So when I started speaking, I'd say, The one thing I promise you, I'm going to be a better chancellor tomorrow than I was today. And all my critics said, yeah, but that's a very low bar. But you got to start someplace. You got to start someplace. You've got to create that kind of vision in the system. So that I don't care if you've been here 25 years or 1,000 years, you've got to be better tomorrow. Kids need that. You've got to feel that. And we don't have that in the culture of the public school systems. And that's got to change.
To the question, $38 billion a year is the education budget. I don't know if you recall what it was when you left office.
21 billion.
21. So where does all the money go? I think people look at that $38 billion a year.
Peter, Paul, and Mary, where have all the flowers gone? Long time passing. Where it goes into salary, it goes into pensions. I mean, think, the whole pension system, we reward people not to work, right? If you're a teacher, you get your pension, you can go out and get a second or third job. You're making more money when you retire, and you're working much less hard. It's an irrational, structured system, and so you've got to change those kinds. Not that people shouldn't have a pension, of course they should have a pension, but suppose you only want to work as a teacher for 10 years. Suppose I could get Jason Riley to teach for 10 years. He's never going to get a pension of any consequence if he does that. But suppose I wanted to front load his salary, and he said, instead of starting at $50,000, start at $80,000, no pension because you're not going to be here long enough. And I can get people like that. You would think people would be trying to find those solutions. Not a chance.
Interesting.
I appreciate your candor and your passion. Wish we had more like you in the system. So I know you touched briefly about the topic of Asians and their achievement. They're oftentimes labeled as the inconvenient minority because they're starting with a lot of the same hurdles, poverty, economic hardship, a lot of them in the city, and yet they advance through the school system where other minorities don't. So I'm curious, what thoughts you had about what's happening outside of the classroom that's enabling that kind of achievement, mobility, and excellence, and how can we bring that to all kids?
It's a very complicated question, but I will say this. One of the things we haven't talked about, and if I should have answered to your question, the 0 to 5 period in a kid's life we're getting killed on. The average kid who came to schools when I was chancellor from a poor neighborhood had about 20% of the vocabulary of a kid who grew up in a middle-class family. And so a lot of this is, family structures that are not working particularly well, parents who've got to work 2, 3 jobs, kids who are being raised by grandparents, et cetera, et cetera. So you start with this enormous deficit, and then you try to see if you can correct it, and already you're way behind in the beginning. So I think you've got to create a culture, and you've got to start to address, if I were the czar, that may be a bad, given what's going on in Ukraine, that may be bad. But if I were the king, I would spend some time on 0 to 5 to try and build the vocabulary, build the curiosity of kids who are coming from challenged environments. We got a lot of kids in the city who grew up in homeless situations, so you gotta, there's a lot of collateral things out there to change. And my own view of that is, if we don't, at best we're gonna do okay. We will never do really well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's in a word, culture, and it's something a lot of people still aren't comfortable talking about. I'm sorry? Oh yeah, I'm.
Well, what's that book you wrote? Stop trying to help us?
Yeah, but I do think it's culture, and having that the right culture, the right attitudes and habits and behaviors can help a group overcome a lot, a minority group overcome a lot. I mean, in a word, that stereotypical, it starts with that stereotypical tiger mom usually being married to a tiger dad. And it really flows from there. And it's not a phenomenon you only see here in the US, but you see it among the Chinese in Southeast Asia. You see it all over the world among different groups that have that human capital. But unfortunately, talking about fatherless homes is something that still gets you in a lot of trouble in a lot of discussions in this country, and I think that's a big problem. Sure.
Thank you for this good discussion. So you touched on the fact that there's something flawed about the system. I mean, do you ever really think we can change the system unless we put the power in the hands of parents? Because administrations come and go. You were in an administration that worked and did a lot of good things. Then an administration comes along and everything goes back. But if the parents had the power, if the money was in the hands of the parents, they could actually just leave and people would have to respond to that. Can you just, I know it's not likely to happen in a place like New York, but in a state like Florida, where they have 49% of students now who go to some place other than their assigned public school, results have gone way up.
Yeah.
They're not perfect, but it's a lot better. Can you just, and in other countries, European countries, money follows the child. Why can't somebody, just get that through their head in this country and why we're talking around it all the time?
Well, you know the answer. I mean,
It's the teachers' union.
it's a question of political will, and if you don't have, I said candidly, the bargain that was cut was charters, not vouchers. That was now, unfortunately, it's neither. So that makes it even harder. The answer to your question, they can't roll back everything. The one thing I think people really, if I were David or anybody else who try to do this, building schools that work. That's why they need the cap, because they know what will happen. If you take off the cap, you'll continue to see Success Academy getting more and more people going there, creating options that people want. And if you do that, then the system is going to end up having to change. And the next mayor can't change that. You will not take away Success Academy schools, no matter what he thinks of them. So I think that those things persist and endure. Internal things don't. The money follow the kid thing, it makes perfect sense and would be sound policy. The chances of it happening either at the national level or certainly in blue states are zero. And so to me, as a political matter, I fight for charter schools. I'm proud of the fact that there are well over 100 charter schools that exist now that didn't exist when I started. And I would think if I were the next chancellor, it's a fight I would take. But vouchers, I think you'd be blowing in the wind.
Well, let me push back a little bit. You said it's a matter of political will. But Mayor Adams was not the union's first choice.
I get it.
And I remember a line very well from Michael Bloomberg when he became mayor, where he said often, the unions didn't put me in office.
Right.
I don't owe them anything. I can be. He had all the political will in the world. Yet they were still able.
You can't open the charter.
Still able to wait him out.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think it gets to a question of whether these unions have too much control over public education. I mean, during the pandemic, this became very apparent to a lot of people for the first time. If our kids can't go to school, we can't go to work.
Right.
And do we want this entity to have this sort of control over our children's education and by extension, over our lives?
Correct.
I mean, have we reached a point where we need to reconsider the control that these unions have over public education?
I don't know when you say reconsider. You and I can reconsider it. This woman here I've never met who seems very sensible. The three of us can reconsider it. But if they don't reconsider it in Albany or Washington, what the hell's the difference? What does it matter? That's the point. That's why I say building coalitions matters. And really, if you want to know one of the great critiques of school reform, we haven't gotten involved enough people of color in leadership positions to be able to make the case you've made often, and that has to happen. And so, I'll never forget the number of people who said to me, in churches and elsewhere, they said, for the first time when I used to go to all these black churches, I knew what it meant to be part of the diversity. I mean, I'm the only white guy in the whole church. They look at me and they say, you're a white guy, right? So I get it. So I think that's part of the answer. The thing you're saying when people start to see this, that's also why in the end every mayor, just for the reason you said they can't go to work, every mayor fears it's strike. And so they do have the nuclear bomb if they need to detonate it. And that's a constraint on the overall system.
Okay. Well, we are out of time, but thank you, Joel Klein, for being here. Appreciate it.
Always
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. We have some closing remarks here.
Jason, Joel, that was amazing. Thank you so much for wrapping up our program so well. That's the that concludes our content now for drinks, but I also just want to say thanks to you, and thank you to Steve Klinsky. This is the inaugural Klinsky Leadership Series. We're going to have a series not just of events like this, but case studies, so we can learn from the examples of cities around the globe and New York City's own past about how we can lead into the future. We're going to have more events, more research. We not only, I guess I was going to say, we hope Mayor Adams is listening, but I'll actually correct that. We will make sure Mayor Adams is listening. And all the people who are up here, they all have voices, and we are so grateful that we can give them that voice. And you have a voice as well. So I hope that you take what you've learned and go and run with it. We are all part of this future together, so please continue to come to these events. And now I'll stop being between you and drinks. Thank you so much.